devil who no devil has seen hide nor hair of in 2 centuries, makes himself known to the underworld again. But this time, he is different. Stronger, sexier, and, are those white devil wings? Is he a Nephalem? Why yes he is. Chapter 1. Anything you recognize isn't mine. It was just Azane Hyudu's luck. First she gets killed by a fallen angel on her first ever date, then suddenly reincarnated by the #1 beauty of her school, Kuo Academy, told that she's a devil, and then she meets a nun, making her first ever real friend, and then the fallen angel that killed her in the first place comes and kidnaps the nun, provoking Azane into coming to this church which her master, Roxas Gremory, had forbidden her to go near in an attempt to rescue her. And now the nun, Ossia Argento, was dead, and the fallen angel, who had introduced himself as Apoj Evma, had stolen Asia's sacred gear, Twilight Healing, and was mocking her viciously. Apoj was a very attractive young man, a couple of years older than Azane, with violet eyes, and a lean, muscular body. He had long, silky-looking black hair, down to just below his shoulders, and he had 4 black, feathered wings extending from his back. He wore a black leather jacket, over a plain dark purple t-shirt, and ripped jeans, along with black boots that had spikes on the bottom of them. "Ah, isn't it wonderful, Azane?" Apoj asked, extending his right hand which had a silver ring with a blue-green gem on it out to his left forearm, where there was a small cut and let a green glow emit from the ring, healing his wound. No matter what physical wound it is, Twilight Healing, the smile of the Holy Mother, whatever you call it, it does just that, heals everything. Wonderful ability for us fallen angels, as we no longer have divine protection. With this, I can truly assist Azazel and Shemhazai in any way they desire. I can make them see that I can be a powerful fallen angel, serving them as they please. I don't care. Azane replied, her voice a low growl as she gently laid the corpse of Asia, a pretty young girl with golden blonde hair, down onto a pew, and stood up. She didn't have to die for your stupid cause. Azane had chocolate brown hair, tied into a short ponytail that went down to her back, matching eyes, and, for her age, a rather voluptuous figure. She wasn't the bustiest woman in Kuo Academy, but certainly not a washboard, either. She wore the Kuo Academy girls' school uniform, which consisted of a white, long-sleeved, button-down shirt, with a black ribbon on her shirt collar, worn under a black shoulder cape and matching button-down corset, a magenta skirt with white accents. She also wore blue trainers and black socks. Yes, she did. Apoj replied, conjuring up a light spear and pointing it at Azane. That is the fate of those born with a sacred gear, especially one as useful as hers. Sacred gears, despite being created by God, are too much for humans to handle. They may be wonderful, but the unusual powers that humans like Asia were born with will be feared, and their wielders shunned. That little exiled nun would have been hunted her entire life, best case scenario. What I did was a mercy. And besides, it was an honor for her to die for my cause. Fuck you. Azane screamed, lifting her left hand up, and letting a red light overcome her hand. When it cleared, a red gauntlet with 2 golden spikes had manifested there, leaving her fingers uncovered. Apoj would have laughed in Azane's face, reminding her that when she tried to use her sacred gear against her, it only resulted in the persistent little devil getting injured, and nearly killed. However, Azane's rage was such that the gauntlet on her arm began to change. Dragon-like claws emerged on Azane's fingers, covering them up. The gauntlet also became bigger, covering up a majority of Azane's arm. What? Apoj shouted, backing off, and creating another light spear. That can't be possible. He made to throw the 2 light spears at Azane, but one small thing happened to get in the way of that. That one small thing being that Apoj felt a small, bullet-like thing traveling into the back of his head, through his brain, and out of the other side. And that was the last thing that he ever felt, before falling to the ground, and fading away. Quote. What? Azane, shocked out of her extreme sadness and anger, cried, as she looked, and saw someone standing in the doorway of the church that Kaneko Tuju, the rook of her master, Roxas Gremory Azane was her pawn, had destroyed earlier, with their hands in a gun pose. The person put the handgun up to their face, and lightly blew, imitating that smoke was raising from his fingers and that he was blowing it away. The person then walked into the church, and Azane realized that this person was a man. The man was very handsome, and looked to be rather young, looking to be in his early 20s. His silver hair, which seemed to emit an ethereal glow in the light of the moon, as it was presently nighttime, flowed down to his upper back, and was tied up with a golden headband. His eyes, which were red, the same red, Azane mentally mused to herself as Ria's hair surveyed the scene. The man wore a pair of black jeans with a silver chain drooping down over them, a white t-shirt underneath that had the logo and name of the American heavy metal band Avenged Sevenfold on it, a black leather jacket, similar to Apoj's, and a pair of red sneakers with white laces. The man continued his casual walk, as if he had just basically vaporized a 4-winged fallen angel, and looked at Azane silently. The brunette seemed to shrink a little, as though the man only stood 1 inch above Azane. He seemed to stand with a cold that just overpowered the young reincarnated devil, and made her feel barely 3 inches tall. "Do not be afraid," the man said, speaking in a voice that, while calm, and rather quiet, still radiated power and authority. "I don't mean you any harm." As Azane stayed quiet, the man walked over to Asia, and carefully picked up her arm, and felt for a second. "Fuck," he whispered. "Stone cold dead. Oh well." The man picked Asia up, walked over to where a Poge had fallen, and picked up Asia's sacred gear, the 2 rings that it took the form of having fallen to the ground. The man placed the rings in his pocket, slung Asia over his shoulder in a fireman's lift, and made to walk out of the church, but his physical way was impeded by someone standing in the doorway, her arms folded. Azane breathed a mental sigh of relief when she saw who the person was. That person standing in the doorway was her master and king, Roxas Gremory. Roxas Gremory was a beautiful young woman with fair, white skin, blue eyes, and a very buxom figure, much more buxom than Azane's. The feature that separated her from other beautiful women was her long, beautiful crimson hair, that reached down to her thigh with a single hair strand sticking out from the top. Her hair also had loose bangs covering her forehead, and side bangs framing her face. She wore the same school uniform as Azane did. "Hey," Roxas said, her voice sounding cool pleasant, though Azane detected a small bite in her voice, a sign that she was serious. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" "Oh, me," the male replied, turning to look at Roxas. "I'm just here, walking around, thought I'd see the scenery, saw shit going down here, and I decided I'd intervene." He then grinned. "What are you doing here, Roxas?" "This is territory, belonging to the House of Gremory, given to me by my older brother, Sirzechs Lucifer himself," Roxas replied, raising her voice slightly, as a crimson aura began to emanate around her body. "And I would like to know just who you are, waltzing into this church, and taking whoever you want. I can clearly sense that you're a devil, or at least part devil, so don't try to hide it." "Ah, so Sirzechs gave you this territory?" the man replied, nodding, while completely ignoring the aura around Roxas, which became more and more intense by the second. "I see. Also, you can sense I'm part devil, Roxas?" the man replied, raising a silver eyebrow, and, dear, I must be getting sloppy with my concealment." He shrugged, making Asia's dead body shake lightly on top of him. "I'm just here on an errand," he continued. "That involves this cute little nun, here. I'll be off right now, if that's what you'd like." He turned to leave, but looked at Roxas. "Oh, and Roxas?" "What?" Roxas replied, glaring at the man, who looked back at her very calmly. The man walked towards the crimson-haired beauty, who stood her ground, and spoke softly to her. "Speaking of Sirzechs, if you see him in Grayfia again, could you tell them that Roxas Gremory says hi?" he asked. Roxas took intense satisfaction in seeing Ria's expression of mixed anger and confidence totally shatter when she heard her own name repeated back at her, and the realization that, if this territory belonged to the House of Gremory, then it was Roxas's territory as much as hers. Roxas smiled at Roxas, whispered, "Good." Back to her, and walked backwards, where he created a silver magic circle, the symbol inside which being a crimson rose, spread 10 bat-like devil wings, stepped into the circle, and disappeared in a flash of silver light. Once the light cleared, Azane looked at Roxas, who looked even more shocked than she did before. She stood still, her mouth slightly open, and her eyes wide. "Roxas?" Azane asked. "What's wrong?" Roxas whispered. "His devil wings, they were white." Quote. Line break. A silver transportation circle with the symbol of a crimson rose opened on the poolside, and Roxas Gremory emerged from it, carrying Asia on his shoulder, and once he fully emerged, he took a deep breath. "Ah," he whispered. "I love the seaside." Quote. Roxas was standing on the side of the large swimming pool, located in the grounds of his private villa, which stood on the sunny island of Minorca, which would just be a 1-hour 30-minute flight from Madrid, the capital of Spain. The villa was large, and contained everything that Roxas and the women living with him needed. A pool, as mentioned already, a kitchen, dining room, living room, and 4 bedrooms, each with extremely comfortable, king-sized beds. It was the pinnacle of luxury, and Roxas loved every minute that he spent here, after purchasing it from its owner nearly 10 years ago. The door to the poolside opened, and Roxas heard 3 separate female cries of surprise and happiness. Turning around, the silver-haired devil looked upon 3 of the women that he presently lived with. Akasha Bloodriver, one of his wives, a pure-blooded vampire, formerly of the Carmilla faction of vampires, Penemu Agrat, another of his wives, a fallen angel, succubus hybrid and the daughter of Azazel, the governor-general of the fallen angels, and Agrat, one of the 4 sex demon progenitors. And Akano Himahima, a fallen angel, human hybrid, the daughter of Barakil, a fallen angel Kadri, and a former member of the Himahima clan, Shuri Himahima. She was a woman who wasn't one of his wives, but still certainly loved by Roxas ever since he'd saved both Akano and Shuri from being killed by members of Shuri's former clan, as well as the rest of his harem. Akasha was a very beautiful woman, with long, straight pink hair and green eyes, along with a pair of vampiric fangs. She had creamy, pale white skin, and a very voluptuous figure, as most female vampires did. She wore a black, two-piece bikini, the upper portion of which was tied around her neck, and both upper and lower parts of which had lacy white frills on. Though she was a vampire, and would usually be unable to go out in sunlight, especially not when the day was as sunny as this, she wore a special sun cream developed by Roxas himself, that negated the negative effects that sunlight had on a vampire, and permitted Akasha to go out in sunlight, especially the pleasant mid-afternoon sun of Menorca. Penemu Agrat, as a hybrid of the two species that, it was told, the females of were the most sexually attractive, was also of incredible beauty. She had strong-looking, golden eyes, long purple hair that went down to her back, and large breasts, which were complemented by her equally large hips. She wore a light purple bikini that strained to contain her incredibly large bust, which was the largest of his harem. And even then, it was so small that the young fallen succubus hybrid was practically naked anyway. As there were magical wards around the villa that prevented any visual clues to the supernatural's existence from being seen by anyone outside them, Penemu had her fallen angel wings, all 8 of them, and her succubus tails, which all ended in the shape of a love heart, all 3 of them out. Akano was a beautiful young woman in her late teens with a voluptuous figure, very long black hair, which hung all the way down to her legs. She usually used an orange ribbon to keep it in place, and violet eyes. She wore a white bikini with red trim, the upper part of which was tied in place behind her neck, and the bottom part of which looking a lot more like a thong than a bikini bottom. Like Penemu, she also had her fallen angel wings out. All 8 of them. "Hey, girls." Roxas greeted Akasha, Penemu and Akano. "You all been good while I was gone." "Oh, we were." Akano replied, stepping forward and leaning forward, making to press her huge breasts into her boyfriend's chest. "Though we enjoy being bad girls a lot more. Especially with you, Rox tilde as tilde." "Hey." Roxas replied, grinning, and delivering a kiss to Akano. "Now. Has anyone seen?" "Ah, don't I get a kiss too, Roxas?" Penemu stepped forward, and placed her hands on Roxas's chest, massaging it gently. "You know how much I love your kisses, as well as your cuddles, and—" "Yes, yes, Pen." Roxas replied, rolling his red eyes slightly, and kissing Penemu on the lips as well. Penemu made to wrap her arms around her husband and deepen the kiss into something more explicit, but Roxas pulled back before she had the chance to. "What about me, Roxas?" Akasha leaned forward. "Don't you want to give your vampire wife a kiss, along with maybe something else?" "Oh, yeah." Roxas replied. "You need your weekly pint of blood, Akasha." Lying Asia on a deck chair, he leaned forward, sticking his neck forward for Akasha, who bared her vampiric fangs and slowly sunk them into Roxas's neck. Akasha gave a low groan of satisfaction as she, over the course of half a minute, sucked about a pint of blood out of Roxas's neck, blood that she, as a vampire, needed to survive, and then pulled off him. "Thanks, Roxas." Akasha whispered, pressing her lips against his. "I've got all the strength I need for certain other activities we can do tilde." She licked her lips seductively, making Roxas chuckle slightly. "What's going on?" Another female voice asked, as the door to the poolside opened again, and another female came walking out, rubbing her eyes. She was stunningly beautiful, and appeared to be her late teens, just like Akano, with long silver hair, tied into a ponytail, and hazel eyes, along with possessing a rather voluptuous figure, just like Akasha, Penemu and Akano. She wore a dark green V-neck shirt, giving view to her generous cleavage, with a high-collared black leather jacket over it. She also wore burgundy jeans with a silver chain drooping down over them, and black leather chaps, with 3 bands encircling his right calf, and black shoes with black buckles. "Oh, hey Roxas." "Hey, Valian." Roxas greeted Valian Lucifer, the devil-human hybrid divine dividing possessing great-granddaughter of Lucifer, the first devil, and Azazel's surrogate daughter. "Just had a nap." "I was trying to." Valian replied. But then some people, she glared at Akasha, Penemu and Akano, who all pretended to look innocent, decided to make a noise and interrupt the nap. She then looked to her deck chair, which Asia lay in. "Who the hell is that?" Akasha, Penemu and Akano then all noticed Asia, and turned to Roxas. "Yeah, who is she?" Akasha asked. "Why is she back here?" "I was going to tell you, but then you decided to try and seduce me into having a collective foursome." Roxas replied. "Your fault I didn't tell you earlier." "What's going on?" Everyone heard another voice, and the door opening for a 3rd time, and a 5th woman walking out. This woman was, arguably, the most beautiful of the 5 members of Roxas's harem. She appeared to be in her early 20s, just like him, with very long emerald green hair reaching down to her lower legs. She wore a white dress with numerous gold ornaments to accommodate the dress. She wore a golden laurel crown, golden fibula with a red jewel in the center, vine-like patterns on the hem of her dress, brown-colored footwear, and various other accessories. "Hey, Palutena." Roxas greeted his first wife, Palutena, the only known daughter of the biblical god himself, as well as the daughter of Hera, the present wife of Zeus, and the Greek goddess of marriage. He walked over to her, and gave her a hug which she happily returned to her husband. "Hey, Roxas." Palutena replied, planting a kiss on her husband's head, and pulling back. "How was your mission? I can go and tell Michael and Azazel about it right now, if you'd like." "Nah. I'll do it myself," Roxas replied. "I guess you could say that the mission was a half success." "Half success?" Valian blinked. "What do you mean, Roxas?" "What I mean, Valian, is that all the Rouge fallen angels were killed." Roxas replied. "I only had to kill one of them, it's presumable that the other 3 were killed by someone else." He shrugged. "Anyway, as you can see, I was unsuccessful in saving the young nun's life. She was dead before I got there." He looked over at Asia with a slightly sorrowful look in his eye. Palutena wrapped her arms around Roxas, and pressed her lips against his neck, gently. "Don't blame yourself for this, Roxas," Palutena whispered. "You didn't have any hand in her death." "I know," Roxas replied. "But we get it, Roxas," Akasha replied. "You have a thing for keeping the number of unnecessary deaths on missions involving you at a big fat 0. She seems freshly dead." Palutena walked over to Asia and looked carefully at her. "Want me to tend to her? Try and bring her back. It'd do a lot for my conscience," Roxas replied. "Thanks, Palutena." The green-haired goddess picked Asia up, and silently walked back into the villa. Roxas looked after her, before Akino pressed herself against his back, and kissed his neck. "Roxas Tilda?" she asked. "Are you going to come and swim with us, now that you're back, Tilda?" "Oh, yeah," Roxas replied. "Might as well. It's an amazing day. Coming, Val." "Nah," Valian replied, walking back into the villa. "I'm gonna go back to sleep." Roxas shrugged, and retreated into the villa himself. 5 minutes later, Roxas was back outside. This time, he wore nothing but a pair of board shorts, which were as black as Akino's hair, with a silver trim on them. His silver hair was still tied up with the golden headband, as he always did, and had always preferred. His very strong, chiseled body, which looked, in Palutena's eyes, like he was meticulously hand-carved by Ishtar, Cleidna, Aphrodite, Rati and Freya, the Babylonian, Irish, Greek, Hindu and Norse goddesses of love, respectively, was also there for all to see, which Penemu, Akasha and Akino all appreciated. Particularly Penemu. "Rar Tilda," she gave a playful growl, and pressed her breasts, which were pretty much bare, against his own chest. "Let's have some fun in the water, Roxas Tilda." Penemu, a grin on her face, pulled Roxas into the water, and held him close to her, while pressing her lips against his in a passionate kiss. Akino and Akasha were all too happy to join in as Roxas returned the kiss, and his hands automatically moved down to Penemu's ass. Line break. A crimson-colored magic circle opened, and Roxas Gremory emerged from it, in the small, yet extravagant, house that was the personal residence of her older brother, Sirzechs Lucifer. Almost immediately upon entering the residence, he heard 2 voices coming from the lounge, and so she made her way there. It was the day after the incident with the fallen angels in Kuo, and after Roxas had shown up. As per his request, though Roxas had no idea who this Roxas was, though felt that she, somehow, had to fulfill his request. When she reached the door of the lounge, which was closed, she knocked, and was told to enter from the inside. And so she did. When she entered the lounge, she saw 4 individuals sat, or rather, 3 sat, one standing, on 2 sofas, each perpendicular to the other. The people sat on the sofas were Sirzechs Lucifer, her older brother and one of the current devil king of the underworld, Roxas Gremory, Sirzechs' son, and Seraphal Leviathan, another of the 4 devil kings and Milikas's godmother. The person who was standing behind Sirzechs and Milikas, was Grayfia Lucifuge, Sirzechs' wife, and the mother of Milikas. Sirzechs was a handsome young man, appearing to be in his early 20s, with shoulder-length crimson red hair, and blue eyes, just like Roxas. He wore attire that one would expect to be worn by royalty, which wasn't inaccurate. Milikas was a cute young boy, appearing to be around 6 or 7 years old, with the same crimson red hair as Sirzechs, though his was a lot shorter than his father's, and red eyes, inherited from Grayfia. He wore a white and red shirt, along with dress trousers and shoes. Seraphal Leviathan was a rather short, yet beautiful, girl, looking to be around the same age as Sirzechs, though one wouldn't have to be idiotically stupid to think that she was a lot younger than that, given her height with long black hair, tied into twin tails, and blue eyes. She had large breasts, despite her childish body. She was dressed in magical girl's clothing, magic wand and all. Grayfia was also a beautiful woman, appearing to be in her early 20s, with silver hair and red eyes. Her hair, which would, if left free, hang all the way down to her back, featured a long braid on each side with small blue bows at the ends, while the rest was let down, ending in twin braids. She wore a blue and white French-made outfit, with long sleeves, and a white-made headband over her head, with red lipstick as a cosmetic accessory. All four of these devils looked up as Rias entered the room. "Oh, Rias." Sirzechs happily greeted his little sister. "What a pleasant surprise to see you here this afternoon." "Hey, Auntie Rias." Milikas greeted Rias happily, to which Rias offered a smile in return. Serafal also gave a smile to Rias in return, and Grayfia looked as emotionless as she did while on the job as a maid. Sirzechs noticed that there was something rather off about Ria's smile. And that, in Sirzechs' mind, wasn't good at all. "What's up, Rias?" he asked, immediately. "Is anything wrong? Has anything happened in Kuo? Was it the fallen angels who you reported to me about yesterday?" No, brother. The fallen angels have been dealt with," Rias replied. "It was just, something happened while dealing with the fallen angels that I thought I should come to you about." "Oh." Sirzechs raised a brow. "Well, do tell. Come have a seat." Quote. Rias nervously sat down, and looked at Sirzechs, who looked back with a concerned face. She then proceeded to explain everything that had happened, with Sirzechs, Milikas, Grayfia and Serafal offering exactly 0 questions between them. "I went to the church to see if my pawn had done well with dealing with the fallen angel," Rias continued, inwardly happy that she was coming to the end of her tale. "But when I went there, I found that said fallen angel had been killed. Not by a Zane, but by someone else." "I see," Sirzechs replied. "And what did this person look like?" "Well," Rias replied, furrowing her brow. He looked a lot like you." "Really?" Sirzechs replied, interested. "Anything else? Any distinctive features?" "Well, he had silver hair," Rias replied. At this word, Grayfia's face broke from the emotionless mask of earlier, and she began to look very hopeful. Sirzechs was also hopeful, though he kept it under wraps. "Silver hair," he muttered. "What color were his eyes?" "Red," Rias replied, simply. Grayfia widened her own eyes, and Serafal began to look interested. Could it be? She thought. Milikas, wholeheartedly confused, looked from his father, to his mother, to his aunt, to his godmother, in very quick succession. "Did this person say anything, Rias?" Grayfia spoke for the first time, leaning forward. "Yes, he did," Rias replied, clearing her throat, which was starting to become dry. "He said to give you and Grayfia a message. He wanted to tell you that Roxas Gremory says hi." As fast as anything, Sirzechs quickly leaned forward and grabbed hold of Ria's shoulders. "Roxas Gremory, Rias. Are you sure that he said the name Roxas Gremory?" he asked, sounding urgent, and more hopeful than he'd ever sounded in his life. "Why yes," Rias replied, trying to pull away from her older brother, but finding herself unable to, such was his strength. "I'm sure." "Why?" Sirzechs, Grayfia and Serafal all shared a three-way look. "Thank you, Rias." Serafal, but strangely one who hadn't spoken at all throughout this entire meeting. "You can go." Rias started, but then chose not to speak. She silently left via transportation circle. Once she was gone, Milikas spoke up. "Father, who is Auntie Rias talking about? Who is Roxas?" "Roxas Gremory, Milikas." Sirzechs replied. "Is the first child that I and Grayfia had. He's your big brother." Milikas's eyes widened at this fact. "I'm also Roxas's godmother Tilda." Serafal chimed in. "When he was a little kid, Roxas used to love me Tilda." Grayfia, for the first time that anyone had ever seen, was starting to get slightly tearful. She'd loved her son, who was named as the Gremory heir before Rias was born, and took over the title, more than anyone could ever hope to love him, and when he'd left the family for some unexplained reason, just over 2 centuries ago, she'd almost shut down entirely, under the impression that Roxas must have hated her and Sirzechs, and had left the family, left her, for that very reason. But if he had asked Rias to say that he says hi to both and Sirzechs, then that must mean that he doesn't hate them. Right. Well, no matter if he hated his parents and family or not, it didn't change the fact that Grayfia and Sirzechs had been spending every spare moment since the end of the War of 1812 looking for him. Line break. It was now late at night in Minorca, where Roxas Gremory lived. In his and Palutena's personal bedroom in his villa, he was lying on his bed, which he shared with Palutena, and wearing nothing but a pair of red boxers, and watching the movie Darkest Hour. As he kept watching the movie, the door between Roxas's bathroom and the bedroom in which he lay, and his gorgeous wife, Palutena, who stood an inch taller than him, came walking into the bedroom. Palutena, in turn, wore nothing but a sexy white bra and matching thong. Seeing her husband of nearly a century who turned off the TV, Palutena smiled, walked over to the bed, climbed upon it, and gently wrapped her arms around her husband, giving a soft sigh of contentment. "How's the nun?" Roxas asked. "Any joy?" "Yes." Palutena replied. "I've managed to bring her back to life, as a full-blooded angel. She's currently sleeping in Valian's room." "Ah." Roxas replied. "Nice one. That'd be your first 100% successful creation, would it not?" "Yes." Palutena replied. "Third time's the charm, eh?" "Indeed." Roxas replied. "Pitt, as peppy and chipper as he can be, was still a defect when you created him. Thank your father for the fact that Michael was able to stop him from dying with those brave saints." "Yeah." Palutena replied. "And when I tried to turn you, you ended up becoming a Nephalem, rather than an angel. Not that that's a bad thing." Roxas replied. "I'm much better off, and much more powerful, for the fact that I'm a hybrid of a devil and an angel. Not that I wasn't weak on my own, or anything." "No, you definitely weren't weak." Palutena replied. "When I met you, you were already ultimate class, in terms of power, and now, it's pretty easy to compare the raw power, both demonic and angelic, in your body to the amount of raw energy in mine." "Indeed." Roxas replied, turning his head and pressing his lips against Palutena's. "Power that you certainly appreciate, as my wife." "Yup tilde," Palutena replied, yawning. "Anyway. Let's get some sleep, love. We're meeting with Michael, Gabriel, Azazel and Shemhazai tomorrow. You can tell how your mission went." "Sure." Roxas replied, shifting himself into a more comfortable position, and letting Palutena rest her head on his chest. The silver-haired Nephalem closed his eyes, and fell asleep, with his gorgeous wife following suit. Chapter 2. Anything you recognize isn't mine. It was the incessant buzzing of the alarm on his phone that slowly roused Roxas Gremory from sleep. Yawning, and holding an arm over his eyes to block out the powerful sun rays that just happened to keep finding their way through his bedroom windows, which also functioned as doors onto a balcony, Roxas reached out with his other hand, and groped around until he grabbed his phone, which was lying on his bedside table, and vibrating loudly, while on charge. Yawning again, Roxas swiped on the screen of his phone, shutting the alarm off, and slumped back onto his bed, away from the window, and closed his eyes again, just wanting to go back to sleep. He really didn't want to get up. His bed was so comfortable, like he could just melt into it forever, and he had the embrace of his literal goddess of a wife. All was amazing with the world, and it was just the greatest thing ever. Speaking of his wife and embraces, Roxas felt the bare, amazing feeling of Palutena's breasts pressing up against his back. Strange. Roxas thought. I could have sworn that she was in a pair of underwear last night. Roxas then heard a soft moan, and felt Palutena moving behind him slightly, as his green-haired lover woke up. Roxas. Palutena mumbled into Roxas's ear, just as Roxas realized that Palutena, rather than being beside, on top of him, like she was last night, was behind him, and had been spooning him. Good morning, love. Morning. Roxas shifted himself slightly, but couldn't escape Palutena's embrace. You're naked. MMMHMM. Palutena replied. I got really warm in the middle of the night, so I just decided to take my underwear off. Besides, it wasn't the most comfortable thing ever. She then adjusted herself slightly, so Roxas was closer to her as she hugged him. You don't mind, do you tilde? Oh, no way. Roxas replied, as Palutena shifted herself and Roxas around under the covers, so her naked body, in all its glory, was on top of her husband's, rather than behind him. The silver-haired Roxas certainly appreciated Palutena's long, green hair falling free in a pair of curtains around him. You know, Roxas, we've still got a bit of time tilde, the daughter of God whispered. Before we go and meet up with the leaders of heaven and Gregory, that is. That is something nice to hear. Roxas replied. Palutena gave a smile to her husband in return as she leaned forward, and pressed her lips against his in a soft, yet passionate and loving, kiss. Almost by pure instinct, Roxas's hands made their way up, and caressed the smooth, white skin of Palutena's arched back, and slowly made their way down to her ass, which he squeezed, and slowly pushed onto his crotch, a certain part of which was throbbing unpleasantly in the restraints of his boxers. Tilde, Palutena moaned, as one of her hands slowly moved to behind Roxas's head, and pushed him further into her, deepening the kiss into a pure make-out session. Roxas tilde, she whispered, once she came up for air, before diving back into the kiss. Roxas, getting a naughty idea, used his fingers to lightly tease Palutena's bare pussy under the sheets, which elicited a loud moan into his mouth from his wife, which the 10-winged Nephalem took as encouragement to continue his ministrations. Oh, my tilde, Roxas and Palutena both froze, mid-make-out, as they heard another voice speaking, from his bedroom door. Don't you two look like an amazing couple? Maybe I should join in instead of cooking breakfast tilde. Palutena shifted herself off Roxas's body, and lay on her back in bed, letting both of them see Akino Himahima, who was carrying a couple of plates of eggs and bacon, while wearing nothing but a black thong and white apron, that covered only the front of her body. "You can come and sit with us, you know, Akino," Roxas remarked, sitting up on the bed and shifting himself, leaving a space for Akino. "You're not below me, you're not a part of a peerage." I know. Akino replied, as she walked forward, laid the plates of food in front of Roxas and Palutena, and then sat down next to Roxas as they ate. "Do you like it?" she asked, as Palutena and Roxas tucked into their food. "It's as good as ever, Akino." Roxas smiled, pulling Akino into a kiss, while trailing his hand down to her ass and squeezing it. "Thank you." "No problem," Akino replied, kissing back. "Even though you're not my king, you still saved my and my mother's lives. I'm eternally grateful to you for that fact. And we're both all the happier for it," Roxas replied. "You get your parents, a boyfriend, and training to become strong, and I get a beautiful harem member with the greatest cooking I've ever eaten." Quote. "Oh, stop it, Roxas." Akino looked away. "You're making me blush, Tilda." "Oh, am I?" Roxas asked, teasingly, as Palutena looked on, amused. "Oh, well." He backed off, suddenly. "You're hot, whether you blush or not. Speaking of your parents, aren't you going to see them today?" "Yes, I am," Akino replied. After Roxas and Palutena finished their breakfast, Akino picked up their plates and took them away, remarking that she was going to go and get changed. Once she was gone, Roxas and Palutena mutually decided that they would get dressed as well, and so they did. Palutena dressed herself in her white dress, complete with all the accessories that came with them, and Roxas dressed himself in his jeans, t-shirt. This time, it was a white t-shirt with the logo of the American rock band, Skillet, and leather jacket. After lacing up his sneakers, Palutena created a transportation circle for herself and Roxas, and after her husband stepped into it, the two of them left. Line break. At around the same time Roxas and Palutena departed for heaven, it was an hour or so past the end of the school day in Kuo Academy. Roxas Gremory was sat at the desk in the main meeting room for the Occult Research Club, which was just a front for her peerage, which consisted of, including herself, 6 members, 5 of which currently attended this school, finishing off the homework that she had been set today, while Mirajan Strauss, Ria's best friend, queen and third-year student of Kuo Academy, just like Rias, sat on one of the sofas and did some homework of her own. Mirajan was a slim young woman of below-average height, standing a couple of inches below Rias. She had long, white hair that curled slightly at the ends, with 2 bangs framing her face and reaching down to her chest. Her hairstyle's most distinctive trait was a short, upward ponytail at the front of her head. She had large blue eyes, and a curvy, voluptuous body, with large breasts. She, like her king, Rias, wore the Kuo Academy girls' school uniform, though she did away with the black ribbon on the collar of her shirt. So, did Roxas just teleport away? Mirajan asked to Rias, who had been telling her the events of the previous night. She wasn't there to see them, as she was away on a summoning. Yes, he did, Rias replied. After asking me to tell my brother and sister-in-law that he said hi. I'm not sure why, but they got really worked up when I mentioned his name. Seraphal also tensed up as well. Mirajan gave a small snigger. Seraphal. Becoming tense. Are you sure you're okay? She asked, slightly teasingly. Rias silently glared at Mirajan in reply, but giggled herself. Yeah, I am. I'm sure I'm fine, Mira. Rias replied. Though I'm not entirely sure that Sirzechs and Grayfia are, after I brought Roxas up to them. Quote. Right as Rias said that, a silver magic circle formed on the floor, and out of it came the maid uniform-clad Grayfia Lucifuge, looking uncharacteristically urgent. Rias. Rias spoke to Rias. On behalf of your brother, you need to take me to the church where you saw Roxas. It took Rias a second or so to fully process what her sister-in-law had said. What? Rias blinked, standing up, with Mirajan standing up as well. What's going on, Grayfia? Is this about Roxas? All Rias got in reply was a sharp nod from Grayfia as she walked over to Rias. Come on. Grayfia, her voice conveying simultaneous extreme hope and extreme urgency. Let's go. All right. Rias replied, creating a transportation circle that would take them to the abandoned church where the 4 fallen angels had occupied up until the night before, where she and her knight, Yudo Kiba, had killed 3 of them, and Roxas had killed the other one, while Azane tried to rescue a nun whose name, she learned from her cute pawn, was Asia, from being killed by them. She, Grayfia and Mirajan all stepped into the transportation circle, and disappeared, coming out just outside the church, the door of which was still destroyed. Rias, Grayfia and Mirajan all stepped into the church, and Grayfia spoke to Rias again. Well, Rias. Do you know exactly where he disappeared from? Or at least, an approximate location. Yes. Rias replied. I remember. He disappeared from around here. She walked forward until she was just behind the back pews, but in between them. Around this spot. Very well. Grayfia said, stepping forward. Step aside. Rias obeyed her brother's queen's order, and stepped aside, while Grayfia stepped into that very spot, and began focusing her demonic power, which was vast, into the ground at that spot. What? Rias stepped forward. What's up? What are you doing? Grayfia is scanning for the presence of a transportation circle. Rias and Mirajan both jumped in surprise, and whirled around to see Sirzechs Lucifer himself standing in the doorway of the church, and walking in. If luck is on our side, we'll be able to trace the transportation circle that Roxas used, and possibly, be able to follow him using the same circle. You can do that with magic circles? Rias asked, raising her eyebrows. Rias, we're devils. Sirzechs replied, looking at his little sister in slight exasperation. As long as you put your mind to it, and have enough desire and demonic power, you can do pretty much anything. He looked to Grayfia. Any joy, Grayfia? Well, there's good news and bad news. Grayfia replied, turning around. What's the good news? Rias asked, before Sirzechs could. Well, the good news, Rias, is that I am able to sense a transportation circle, with Roxas's magical signature. Grayfia replied. And, the bad news? Mirajan put forward, tentatively. The bad news, Mirajan, is that I can barely sense it at all. Grayfia replied. Sirzechs looked shocked. What? He stepped forward. Grayfia, let me try. Obediently, Sirzechs' queen stepped aside, and Sirzechs stood at the spot Grayfia stood at, and pulled his demonic power into the spot Grayfia said she could sense Roxas's magical signature from. After about half a minute, he came up, also confused. Strange. He muttered. I can barely sense anything, either. Then what does this mean? Rias asked. Does it mean that we won't be able to find Roxas? The simultaneous looks that Grayfia and Sirzechs gave Rias were both enough to nearly make her soil her underwear. And that was something she really didn't want to do, as she was wearing her favorite set of lingerie under her school uniform. It means, Rias. Sirzechs replied, his voice uncharacteristically as cold as Grayfia's usually was. That Roxas has learned how to cloak his own magical signature, and add that cloaking to his transportation circle, in order to prevent us from doing what we mean to do, follow him. Oh. Rias replied. Then, what can we do? Well. Sirzechs created a magic circle on the floor. I do have one idea. A mid-sized lion with fur that seemed to be made of mythical blue fire appeared on the magic circle, and looked obediently up at Sirzechs, who looked back, giving his familiar, a hellcat, a mental command. The hellcat nodded, and disappeared through a transportation circle of its own. What did you tell your familiar to do, brother? Rias asked, curiously. However, her question was answered almost as soon as it left her throat, as the hellcat reappeared through a transportation circle, with someone else accompanying it. This someone was a bewitchingly beautiful and attractive young man, appearing to be in his early 20s, with light blue eyes and slicked back green hair. He had a mysterious aura around him that gave Rias the shivers, and wore a green shirt, blue jacket, and blue dress trousers. Sirzechs. Ajuka Beelzebub, one of the four Satans, Sirzechs' childhood friend and the godfather of both Roxas and Milikas, spoke, as Sirzechs' familiar disappeared. What have you called me here for? Ajuka, my friend, I'm sorry to bother you, but I need you to help me. Sirzechs replied. I need you to try and scan this spot, here. He gestured to the spot he was standing on. I have great reason to believe that Roxas, yes, Roxas, was here, and left through a transportation circle, at this very spot, late last night. Ajuka raised a green eyebrow at the mention of his godson, whom he cared for very much when Sirzechs, firstborn, was a child. Of course, Sirzechs. Quote. Ajuka stepped over to the spot that Sirzechs was stood at after he stepped aside, of course, and began pooling his own demonic powers, the raw amount of which was similar, if not equal to, Sirzechs, into the place where he stood. He hummed, to himself. Yes, I can definitely feel something, here. Are you able to bring it up? Grayfia asked. We know that you're the undisputed best at this sort of thing. Yes, I'll be able to do it. I'll be able to find your son. Ajuka replied. Don't worry yourself, Grayfia. There was silence in the church for another 10 seconds. Come on, yes. A burst of demonic energy flared at Ajuka's feet, and he stepped away to reveal a transportation circle, with the sign of the Astaroth clan, a green capital, A, with a curved trail-like design, rather than the sign of the Gremory clan, in the middle of it. Sweet. Sirzechs replied, rushing forward into the magic circle, with Grayfia quickly following. "Thank you so much, Ajuka." "Anytime, Sirzechs." Ajuka replied, a slightly prideful smile upon his face, as he raised his hand and prepared to trigger the transportation circle. "Make sure to give Roxas my hello when you see him." Quote. Ajuka closed his hand, which activated the transportation circle, and a green light enveloped Sirzechs and Grayfia, which, Ajuka thought, would take them through the transportation circle and to wherever Roxas came out. However, that didn't happen. The green light that was a signal of the activation of Ajuka's transportation circle faded away, and Sirzechs and Grayfia still stood where they were seconds before. Quote. What the hell? Rias was the first to speak. What happened? Evidently, nothing. Mirajan replied. Ajuka stepped forward. That's unexpected. Sirzechs and Grayfia just realized that they were still stood where they were before. Ajuka, what's going on? Grayfia asked, light-killing intent beginning to seep from her body, making Rias and Mirajan, a high-class devil and a mid-class devil respectively, shiver. I thought this was supposed to take us to Roxas. 1. Grayfia, that transportation circle was supposed to take you to where the transportation circle went, not directly to its user. Ajuka replied. And second. I'm not sure. Step off for a moment, and let me try something. Sirzechs and Grayfia stepped off, as Rias and Mirajan looked at each other, utterly perplexed at what was going on. Ajuka stepped into the spot Sirzechs and Grayfia were in, seconds before, rebuilt the transportation circle within 5 seconds, and activated it. The same thing happened. The green light, a result of the circle activating, faded away, and Ajuka stayed in the church. Ajuka hummed. How puzzling. I was sure I did everything on this end right. Ajuka tried for a third time, and got the same result. Or lack thereof, I should say. The green-haired Satan furrowed his brow. Yes, I did do everything on this end right. Ajuka, slightly irritated, muttered. But what the foo? He stopped, and looked from the spot he'd been trying to activate the magic circle on, to Sirzechs and Grayfia, and back again. What? Sirzechs asked. What is it, Ajuka? I think I've got it. Ajuka replied. There must be something preventing the transportation circle from opening on the other end, wherever Roxas teleported to last night. That's the only reason I can think of that this isn't working. Something preventing the transportation circle opening on the other end. Rias repeated. Do you mean, like protection wards, or something like that? Like the ones surrounding the Gremory Manor. That's exactly what I mean, Rias. Ajuka replied. Yes, there must be wards on the other side of this transportation circle. Powerful ones, too, if they rejected my magic circle. Or many-layered. Grayfia replied. Or even both. Indeed. Ajuka replied. I'll return to my lab and see if I can work on this. I'll let you know if there are any results, Sirzechs. Thank you very much, Ajuka. Sirzechs replied. I'm indebted to you. Oh, you needn't be. Ajuka replied, opening another transportation circle. We are best friends, after all. Quote. And with that, unlike with the 3 transportation circle that he used in an attempt to get to wherever Roxas had teleported to the previous night, Ajuka left. Line break. In a striking white light, Roxas Gremory and Palutena appeared through the latter's magic circle, in the meeting hall of 6th heaven, or Zebul, as others knew it as. Whatever the name was, it was where the 10 Seraph, the rulers of heaven, resided, along with where they occasionally invited special guests, which Roxas and Palutena certainly were, along with 2 individuals that were already sat at a table, beside Michael, the current archangels, official leader of the angels and the presently center of the holy system, that the biblical god, Palutena's father, had previously taken control of before he died, and Gabriel, Michael's sister, and the strongest woman in heaven. Michael was a handsome man in his mid-20s, with long blonde hair and perpetually sad-looking green eyes. He was dressed in gold, red and white armor, over a white robe. Gabriel was, in 3 words, jaw-droppingly beautiful. She had curly blonde hair that went down to her back, blue eyes, and a very voluptuous figure, with breasts bigger than Palutena's. She wore a white lily flower in her hair, and a white robe around her body, that exposed very little skin, but showed off her figure brilliantly, which Roxas appreciated very much. Michael and Gabriel were sat with the 2 present leaders of the Gregory, the organization that 95% of the fallen angels were a part of. Azazel, the Governor-General of the fallen angels, and Shemhazai, the Vice-Governor-General. Azazel was tall, appearing to be in his 20s, with an average build, black hair, gold bangs, and a black goatee. He wore a black trench coat that went down to his knees, and a black business suit underneath. Shemhazai also appeared to be in his 20s, with silver white hair and purple eyes. His outfit consisted of a purple beret, a purple trench coat over a black vest, white pants and black boots. Hey, everyone. Roxas, the only individual of the 6 present with devil blood in his veins, greeted the 2 angels and 2 fallen angels. Azazel and Shemhazai both raised greetings to Roxas in return, as he took his seat at a table that had been drawn up, but Michael and Gabriel immediately rose, walked over to Palutena, and dropped to one knee in a simultaneous bow. Roxas sniggered at the sight. He knew how much Palutena loathed it when people bowed before her, but he couldn't blame Michael or Gabriel for doing so. Palutena was the only individual left with God's holy blood running through her veins, which made her, for all intents and purposes, God herself. Rise, the pair of you. Palutena remarked, and Michael and Gabriel immediately rose from their bow. I know I'm the daughter of your almighty father, but, She trailed off. You know what? Forget it. Palutena shrugged her shoulders, walked over to a chair next to Roxas, and sat down in it, as Michael and Gabriel resumed their seats. Greetings to you, Roxas Gremory. Michael bowed his head in a formal manner before Roxas. I hope you're doing well. Very well, thank you, Michael. Roxas replied. And drop the Gremory part, please. We're all friends here. Understood. Michael replied, bowing his head again, before resuming his position. Gabriel, arguably the happiest and the kindest of the seraph, smiled widely at Roxas and waved. Hey, Roxas. She chirped, her melodious voice as beautiful as ever. Roxas smiled, and nodded back to Gabriel, before Michael spoke. Now, Roxas. Palutena informed me that you'd completed the mission that Azazel asked you to do. Michael spoke. Is this true? Yes. Roxas replied, turning to Azazel. So, how did it go? Azazel asked. Any trouble with the devils in Kuo? None. Roxas replied. When I arrived in Kuo and made my way to where the stray fallen angels were said to be holed up, I sensed that there was only one left alive. Evidently the devils of Kuo must have caught wind of them, and moved to exterminate them themselves. That does sound like them. Michael nodded. Go on. Well, I entered the church, killed the only fallen angel left, and found the nun that you heard they'd kidnapped, Azazel. Roxas continued. She was dead. Quote. Gabriel put her hands up to her mouth in horror. She, like Roxas, absolutely hated it when she heard that innocents had died during a mission. However, Roxas replied. Palutena has brought her back to life as an angel, and she's currently sleeping at my house. Oh, good. Gabriel replied, her tone as happy as normal. I always felt sorry for that nun. Even if she was a threat to the system, I still feel uncomfortable with the idea of such a believer being excommunicated. Quote. I know. Michael added, his perpetually sad eyes looking even sadder. We should have found another way. He looked at Palutena. Palutena, I thank you for saving the nun's life. I have faith that you'll make sure that she has a good life, as an angel. Thank you, Michael. Palutena bowed her head. I'll do my best. And we have you to thank, ourselves, Roxas. Shemhazai spoke up. Even though this matter had absolutely nothing to do with you, you still carried it out. Quote. Therefore, it's only right that we offer you a reward for your troubles. Azazel continued. Name your reward, apart from my position as Governor General of Gregory, and it's yours. Roxas thought for a moment, and his mind came up entirely blank. I can't really think of anything at the moment, but I reserve the right to choose later. When I think of something, I'll get back to you. Very well. Azazel nodded. Come on, Shem. We should get back to the Gregory now. Azazel and Shemhazai both stood up, gave their goodbyes to Michael, Gabriel, Roxas and Palutena, and left via their own magic circles, leaving the Nephalem, 2 angels and goddess alone. Gabriel and Palutena stood up, walked over to a corner, and began talking, leaving Michael to walk over to Roxas and speak with him. Roxas. The archangel asked. May I speak privately with you about something? Go for it, Michael. Roxas replied, looking into the eyes of his father-in-law's current successor. Roxas, I'm going to be blunt with you. Michael spoke, his voice slightly more serious than before. I'm not sure you know this, but I've been talking a lot with Palutena, and with your willingness, I believe it would be beneficial, both for all of us in heaven, who I know you think rather highly of, on the whole and for yourself, if Gabriel were to become one of your wives. Yeah, I've heard. Roxas replied. She told me, a couple of nights ago, that you were considering it. But, why? Well, Michael replied. You know that I trust you and Palutena, though the latter is unwilling to ascend to the heavenly throne, implicitly, but certain members of the church, and even some low-ranking angels are unwilling to trust either of you, under beliefs that you, a half-devil, have infiltrated heaven and wish to destroy it from the inside, and that Palutena is not the real God. Quote. Well, to be fair, she isn't. Roxas replied. But she's the closest thing to God that the church and heaven have got, so why are they complaining? Michael sighed. I honestly can't answer that. Michael replied. But I feel that the best, simplest, and only way to settle the growing dispute between us, the leaders of heaven, and the lower levels, along with the church, is to hold a union between you, arguably the highest-ranked male member of heaven, aside from the 7 males of the 10 seraph, and the highest-ranked female member of heaven, Gabriel. Plus, he added, Gabriel thinks extremely highly of you. She talks of you quite often. I'm honored to hear that, Michael. Roxas replied, as he looked up to see Gabriel and Palutena still talking, rather animatedly. But allow me to be blunt in return. If I and Gabriel are to get together, I'm worried that my more carnal side will get the better of me, and I'll end up taking advantage of Gabriel. I mean, she's the most beautiful woman in heaven for a reason, and I would hate to see her fall, which would doubtlessly devastate her. Not only that, but I'd rather not deal with 90% of heaven and 100% of the church coming after my head on a pike as a result of that. He took a breath. It's for those reasons, Michael, that I'm not entirely sure that marrying Gabriel to me is the best option. Oh, I completely understand. Michael replied, holding a hand up. However, for those exact reasons that you stated, I have faith that you can keep yourself under control, if not for Gabriel's sake, then for the sake of heaven and the church, or even for your own sake. Damn you and your boundless optimism. The silver-haired Nephalem muttered, before speaking out loud. Okay, Michael. I'll give it some thought. Thank you, Roxas. Michael replied, bowing his head. If you were to do this for heaven, then we would be indebted to you as well. Quote. Roxas chuckled lightly, then got to his feet. Around that moment, Gabriel and Palutena seemed to have finished their discussion. Palutena stepped forward and created a magic circle, which Roxas stepped into. As Gabriel waved at Roxas, Palutena and her husband disappeared. Line break. We're back, Tilda. Roxas called, as he and Palutena came out in the sitting room of his villa in Menorca, Spain. The living room was slightly more of a home cinema than a sitting room, as there were 3 large sofas, situated in an open square, as in 3 sides of the square were filled up, and the final one was not, leaving it open and all facing the 110-inch Samsung TV, because fuck Apple, which was currently turned off. Anybody home? In here, Roxas. Roxas and Palutena both heard Akasha's voice coming from the kitchen, along with the light sound of munching. When Roxas and Palutena made their way into the kitchen, they saw Akasha sat on one of the stools, with the nun that Roxas had brought from the church sat next to her, eating a chicken sandwich. Ossia Argento looked up at the sight of Roxas and Palutena, and immediately seemed to shrink at the sight of the 2 new people. Roxas noticed this, and just shook his head. I'll be in the shower. He muttered to Palutena. I didn't have one last night. Sure. Palutena replied, watching her husband leave, and watching Akasha go after him. Before he could enter his shower, Akasha caught up with her husband. Roxas. There. Akasha paused for a moment, deciding on whether to tell Roxas this or not, but then deciding to. I felt that someone was trying to get through the wards, sometime after you left. What? Roxas turned around. Yes. Akasha replied. 3 times, in quick succession. They were unsuccessful. Also, Penemu, Valian and Akino have left, to go and spend time with Agrat, Azazel and their parents, respectively. Good. Roxas replied. Nice to know that these wards hold up. And I see. He pressed his lips against Akasha's, and walked into his shower room. Shedding his clothes, leaving him entirely naked, Roxas removed his hairband, and placed it very carefully onto the sink, where he could view it at all times, and after turning on the hot water, stepped into the shower. Grabbing some of his shower gel from the rack, Roxas poured some out, and lathered it into his hair, while idly singing under his breath. Mama, put my guns in the ground. I can't shoot them, anymore, that cold black down is comin' down. Feels like I'm knockin' on heaven's door, Tilda. Line break. Hello, Asia. Palutena sat down in the place that Akasha was sat in, and spoke kindly to Asia. Do you know who I am? Asia, who after getting a load of Palutena's appearance, particularly the hair, and matching it up with a description of her that the nice pink-haired woman had given her, tensed up, evidently unprepared to be addressed. Why yes, miss. Oh, just call me Palutena. Palutena replied. I might be the daughter of God, but I never saw the need for titles. It's nice to meet you. When you're alive, that is. The pleasure is all mine, am I, Palutena? Asia replied, Palutena's words doing very little to reassure her. Palutena shrugged, and continued. Well, Asia, did Akasha tell you anything? Or did she just make you a sandwich? She told me some things. Asia replied, a small smile on her face. That I died, in that church, someone called Roxas Gremory brought me back here, and that you brought me back to life, as an angel. Yup. That's pretty accurate. Palutena replied, pointing her finger at Asia. On the spot, 4 pure white, angel wings protruded from her back, and then disappeared. She also told me about you. Asia continued, after looking away from where her wings had been. And that. Her face fell. Is it true? The nun whispered. That God, your father, is dead. Yes. Palutena replied, her face slightly falling as well. I'm all that's left of God's bloodline. Really? Asia began to tremble slightly. Really? Palutena replied, putting her hand out and gently onto Asia's shoulder. And Asia, I know how you feel, and I completely understand it. I felt the same way you do now, shocked, saddened, and scared. Asia tentatively nodded. Well, I've felt those emotions before, especially when I heard that my father had been killed in the Great War of the Three Factions, and by my husband's grandfather, no less. But that's besides the point. Quote. Asia looked at Palutena, who gave her a sad smile in return. And I'd be lying if I didn't feel sad myself about it, at times. The green-haired goddess continued. However, when I was younger, there's something that my father told me, about 6.5 centuries ago, a few decades before the end of the Great War, that I always remember, even at the young age, by the standards of deities, that is, of 3062. Her smile became slightly more reminiscent now. Father told me that when he died, he knew full well that I'd be sad, but he asked me not to spend too much time crying and mourning over his death. She told Asia. Because, as cathartic as mourning and grief can be, it won't bring him back. No matter how much you do it, no matter how many people do it, my father isn't coming back from the dead. Palutena shifted herself closer to Asia, and continued to speak. However, despite that fact, my father told me that what he wanted, in death, was his believers to believe in him, and in heaven, no matter if he was absent or not. She took a deep breath, and smiled at Asia. Does that help? Asia sniffed, and though there were tears in her eyes, smiled. Yes, it does. She replied. If someone who knew God himself said it, then, well. I'm not infallible like those in the church claim my father was, Asia. Palutena replied, in a rather deadpan tone, before she grinned. Though I do like to pride myself on my intelligence, now that I bring it up. Yeah, you've got the nickname, Professor Palutena, by everyone here, for a reason, love. Palutena and Asia turned, and saw Roxas standing in the doorway of the kitchen, his hair slightly damp, yet done up in his golden hairband, wearing the same skillet shirt and jeans, but doing away with the trainers going barefoot and jacket. Palutena pouted at the use of her nickname, but grinned. Anyway. She replied, to Asia. Asia, let me introduce you to my husband, and the man I love arguably as much as my own father, Roxas Gremory. Yo. Roxas pulled up a stood next to Palutena, and sat down, wrapping an arm around his goddess wife and kissing her on the cheek. Nice to meet you, Asia. And nice to meet you too, Roxas. Asia replied, pausing for a second. If you're Palutena's husband, and by extension, the son-in-law of God, does that make you like Jesus Christ? Roxas took a second to process what Asia had said, before he slammed his head into the counter. Asia then realized what she'd just said, and covered her mouth with her hands, looking at Palutena with scared eyes. I'm sorry. She whispered. I didn't mean to say that, I swear. Palutena just laughed. Asia, it's fine. She laughed. You won't be punished for any blasphemy here. I mean, this house usually has a half-fallen angel, a fallen angel, succubus hybrid, and a vampire residing inside it, along with me and Roxas's. Oh. Asia replied, looking slightly more calm. Roxas slammed his head into the counter again, at the sheer, how the hell could he describe Asia's comparison to him? Stupid. Insane. Roxas Gremory had no idea. Chapter 3. Warning. Lemon in this chapter. Anything you recognize isn't mine. It was much, much earlier in the morning than her usual time of waking when Azane Hyodo felt herself roused from sleep. While in that state that involved one slowly regaining their senses in the aftermath of waking up, Azane came to realize that her right hand was inside her pants, and rubbing at her virgin pussy. She also came to realize, seconds later, that a slightly thick, sticky fluid was slowly oozing from her pussy. It seemed that she'd had an orgasm in the night, had a wet dream. Blushing hard at this fact, Azane grabbed a roll of toilet paper that she kept at her bedside table, ripped a bit off of it, and began to dry herself off. Her pajama bottoms were stained slightly, as best she can. While she did so, Azane tried to remember what she'd been dreaming about, and it didn't take her long to come to what, or who, her nighttime thoughts had drifted to. That silver-haired man who she'd met while in the church. Roxas, his name was. Azane remembered very well the dream she had involving Roxas. Vivid images came up in her mind, that she remembered thinking of during her dream. Images that involved herself and Roxas doing unspeakably naughty things. Man. Azane thought, as she checked her phone to see what the time was. 5:26 a.m., about 2 hours before she usually woke up. I know I'm a pervert, but I don't usually have a wet dream about specific people. The brunette second year cast her eyes around her bedroom, where there were posters of scantily clad individuals, both men and women. I guess there's a first for everything, though I doubt puberty had anything to do with it. What the hell is going on? I think I have a possible answer for that. A deep voice sounded inside Azane's head. Hello again, partner. Oh, hi D-Drake. Azane replied to the heavenly dragon sealed inside her boosted gear. What's up? The ceiling. D-Drake replied, dryly. Anyway, I think I can answer your question. Quote. Well, don't keep me in suspense. Azane replied. What is it? What you're feeling is one of the side effects of the boosted gear. D-Drake replied, patiently. As in, thanks to me being sealed inside here, you gain some mental characteristics of a dragon, but not all, for some reason. Those characteristics could range from an incredible desire to prove yourself in battle, to immense pride, to being attracted to beings that show power. It seems that you have the third trait I mentioned, but I certainly didn't think it would be directed at him. Who? Roxas. Azane blinked, and replied. What's wrong with him? D-Drake sighed, deeply. Remember the saga between myself, Albion, and our respective hosts, that I told you, in great detail, last night? I think I fell asleep for part of it. Azane replied, with a small, nervous giggle. D-Drake gave a growl of displeasure. Lazy, perverted child, he grumbled. Anyway, were you awake when I told you about my strongest host, Belzard? Oh, I remember you mentioning him. Azane replied. Defeated 2 white dragon emperors in his timeline, right? Indeed. D-Drake replied. But my strongest host, a host that could have gone on to challenge gods, if he so desired, was killed, by Roxas Gremory. Quote. Oh. Azane replied. And that's not the only time one of my hosts got involved with that Nephalem. D-Drake replied. I remember that Elsha. What's a Nephalem? Azane interrupted, having not heard the term before. It's the term used for a hybrid between a devil and an angel. They're known for their white devil wings. D-Drake replied. But that's not the point, partner. The point is that Azane, having heard enough of D-Drake's rambling, decided to cut the mental connection between her and him. She lay back on her bed, and shut her eyes, trying to drift off and get another couple of hours sleep. With limited success. Line break. Thanks again for letting me stay here, Palutena. Asia humbly thanked Palutena, who was tucking Asia into bed. In Akino's bedroom. Akino hadn't returned from her trip to Barakil and Shuri. The green-haired goddess had taken the preemptive liberty of covering all of the posters in Akino's bedroom, as she thought that they would frighten Asia. No problem, Asia. Palutena replied. You're my little angel, you can stay here as long as you want. She moved over to Asia and kissed her on the forehead, before retreating from the room and shutting the door. Smiling to herself, Palutena walked over to the bedroom that she and Roxas shared, the door of which was shut, and slowly, quietly, opened it. Inside the room, sat on the bed, cross-legged, eyes closed and clad in nothing but a pair of boxer shorts, was Roxas. The green-haired goddess saw simultaneous light and dark auras spiraling and circling around her husband, and they both seemed to pulsate, in conjunction with the silver-haired Nephalem's slow heartbeat, and his slow breathing. Palutena leaned against the doorway, and watched her husband. Though it looked rather dull to the untrained eye, she rather enjoyed watching her husband meditate. After 5 silent minutes, Roxas slowly opened his red eyes, and noticed Palutena. Oh, hey love. He greeted, as Palutena walked into the room, and sat down beside him. How long were you there? Just about 5 minutes. Palutena replied. How long were you there? She bounced the question back at her husband. About 20 minutes. Roxas replied. Just like Azazel suggested. Good. Palutena remarked, nodding. You've been a lot better since he suggested you start meditating. I remember that you used to spasm out, all the time, thanks to the light and dark element in your body. I know I did. Roxas replied. They weren't fun times. Speaking of fun times. Palutena shifted herself so she was on top of Roxas, and began slowly gyrating her wide hips on top of his, in a position that made it so only the two beings' respective underwear were what shielded them from already fucking. Fancy giving your dear wife a fun time, Tilda? Oh, you know I would love to do that. Roxas replied, shifting Palutena so she was closer to him, as he felt the tool in his pants slowly harden and lengthen. It's honestly a mystery as to how the child of Yahweh and Hera, two of the most so-called sexually pure beings there are, turned out to be such a fucking horndog. Who knows, love? Palutena replied. And honestly, who the fuck cares? Lemon starts here. Palutena was the one to initiate the kiss with her husband, as she placed one hand behind Roxas's head to deepen the kiss between them, and using the other to slowly, but surely, push her husband back until he was lying on his back, underneath her. As Roxas was already half naked, Palutena reached behind her and pulled off her dress, leaving her in her own sexy set of white lingerie, complementing her body perfectly. Once her dress was off her and in a corner, Palutena dived back onto her husband, and intensely made out with him, with the green-haired goddess reaching behind her while kissing Roxas to deftly undo her bra, and leave her large breasts free for her husband to fondle. Roxas, who had invaded Palutena's mouth with his tongue in return for her doing the same to him, was all too happy to oblige, and, like he'd done hundreds, if not thousands, of times before, snaked his hands in between their bodies and roughly gripped her tits, eliciting a moan from Palutena, straight into his mouth. Just like he'd learned to do from sufficient experience in bed with her, Roxas gently squeezed his wife's perfect orbs of flesh. Palutena moaned, as she came up for air, her eyes half-lidded with pure lust. You still know how to please me, Roxas. And why wouldn't I? Roxas asked, grinning as he shifted himself so his face was directly below her breasts, and leaned up so his lips could latch onto her left eat, before sucking on it. They might not be the biggest of my harem, but they're on the woman I love most. Palutena blushed from the pure and honest compliment, the kind her husband was known for. They're still damn tasty, too. Palutena moaned again as Roxas continued sucking on her breasts, switching from the left to the right and the right to the left on occasion, while Roxas gently teased her pussy, underneath her panties. The green-haired goddess groaned. Roxas, I want to do something else. Roxas pulled back, and looked up at his wife. Something else is in this. Palutena replied, winking, and getting up from the bed, and removing her panties, revealing her perfect, naked body for her husband to take in. And after pointing at Roxas's boxers and clicking her fingers, they'd flown off his body as well, leaving his fully erect cock, which clocked in at 11.5 inches, over double the average size for a human, and nearly double the average size for a devil, fully exposed. Palutena then got on the bed, and turned around, shifting her perfect ass and pussy right up into Roxas's face, barely centimeters away from his mouth. Whoever comes first doesn't get to be on top. Palutena challenged Roxas, which was all the warning the 6 centuries-old Nephalem got, before Roxas felt Palutena's head slowly descend onto his member. Roxas moaned, and instantly began to lick at Palutena's womanhood, sticking his tongue in as far as he could go. The green-haired wife of Roxas moaned slightly, and shuddered, but continued to suck on his cock, causing Roxas, in turn, to pick up the pace of eating out his wife, who was even more of a sex goddess than even Aphrodite was. As one would imagine, it very quickly turned into a competition between them, seeing which god-class lover could make the other come first. Palutena, getting a naughty idea, decided to wrap her large breasts around Roxas's cock, and began rocking them up and down, at a fast, yet rhythmic, pace. Fuck. Roxas groaned, feeling the pressure building in his cock. He needed to do something fast. Getting an idea of his own, Roxas reached up and began playing with Palutena's pussy lips with his hand, before sliding the index, middle and ring fingers of his right hand in there, and beginning to quickly pump in and out. Palutena moaned, before twisting her head around. Roxas, that's cheating. And using your tits to pleasure my cock doesn't class as cheating. Roxas jokingly replied through his own moans. I know deities are selfish, Palutena, but come on. He then added his little finger into Palutena's pussy, basically half-fisting his wife, which made her moan louder. Oh, Roxas! Palutena groaned, feeling her orgasm build up inside her, and before she knew it, her orgasm came crashing over her, and quite a bit of femcom squirted from her pussy, and straight onto her husband's face. Palutena flopped onto the bed, panting from her orgasm, as Roxas licked the femcom that he could reach with his tongue off his face, and scooped up what he couldn't reach with his tongue so he could lap it up that way. Hey. Your cum is as tasty as ever, Palutena. He remarked, as he reached out, grabbed Palutena, and positioned her on the bed so she was below him, the reverse of the position they'd been in 5 minutes earlier, and his rock-hard cock, which was pulsating slightly from being about to cum, positioned at the entrance to her pussy, which he could see clearly between her spread legs. You ready? You know I'm always ready to get fucked by you, Palutena replied, wrapping both her legs around her husband's back, locking him in place. Now do it. Fuck your goddess, Roxas. Well, if my goddess commands it. Roxas replied, pressing his lips against Palutena's, before thrusting into her so hard that it caused both lovers to exclaim loudly in pleasure, and to orgasm at the same time. Then I guess it must be done. Quote. Roxas grabbed onto Palutena's slim waist to keep himself balanced as he began thrusting, at a moderately fast pace, inside Palutena, as she grabbed onto the headboard of the bed, moaning loudly as Roxas's hips slapped against hers every time he thrusted. "Oh, fuck Tilda!" Palutena shouted. "Roxas, that's so good. Fuck this divine pussy." Roxas grinned, and obliged, as he slightly upped the speed of his fucking, and moved his hands up to Palutena's large breasts, groping hard on them as he thrust, giving his emerald-haired wife intense waves of pleasure from two different places. Palutena could only gasp in pleasure as she, along with the whole bed, rocked hard, in conjunction with Roxas's thrusts, and she threw her head back to moan louder when Roxas leaned down and started sucking hard on her nipple, while simultaneously pinching and twisting the other one, which, along with his fast thrusts, was enough to drive Palutena over the edge and into a third orgasm. Roxas himself was forced to let out a loud groan of pleasure when Palutena's walls tightened, a telltale sign of an orgasm crashing over her, and it was only after about a quarter of a minute of more thrusting until he shot his second load of the night deep inside his wife. After another minute of gradually slowing down his thrusts while continuing to squirt another occasional load inside Palutena, Roxas stopped thrusting entirely, and lay on top of Palutena, who had slowly unlocked her legs from around her husband, panting slightly. "Fuck me," Roxas whispered, pressing his lips against Palutena's. "How is sex with you always so mind-blowing? Even after 30 years of dating and fucking, and nearly another century of being married on top of that." "Well, I am a goddess," Palutena replied, slightly smugly, as she wrapped her arms around her husband, and pressed her lips against his neck, in a gentle, yet passionate, gesture. "And even if you're not a god, Roxas, is that all you've got?" "Oh, of course not," Roxas replied, picking himself up. "Get on your hands and knees, Palutena. I quite fancy filling your other hole with my cum, tonight." "Of course Tilda." Palutena pressed her lips hungrily against her husband's for a second, and turned herself around so her ass was facing Roxas. Her pussy, which was leaking his cum, also glistened for her husband's eyes, but Roxas, presently, wasn't interested in that. Taking his cock in his hand, he slowly guided it into Palutena's puckering asshole, and began thrusting, at a moderate pace, inside his wife's ass. "Oh, fuck, fuck, fuck," Palutena shouted, from the raw pleasure of having such a tight area of her body penetrated by something so big. As Roxas reached forward and spread her ass cheeks with his hands, his thrust slowly began to become faster, which only increased the volume of Palutena's pleasured moans. "Thank fuck for the soundproofing spells that I put on every wall in this house," Tilda, Palutena, in her slightly crazed state, thought, as Roxas continued to anally screw her. Tilda. Another loud moan left her as Roxas's hands trailed along her body, which was covered in a light coat of sweat, and settled on her breasts, which he squeezed roughly as his hips slapped against Palutena's ass. "Fuck me, pal," Roxas muttered, as he leaned forward and gently whispered into his wife's ear. "Did you get tighter than normal, or is it just me?" I don't know," Palutena replied, letting out a gasp of surprise and pleasure as Roxas gently bit down on her ear. "But you still love fucking my ass, right?" "I love it," Roxas replied. "Your willingness to let me fuck you, a goddess, in such a naughty way is just another of the endless number of reasons that I love you so much." Tilda. Palutena moaned from such pleasure that she reached her fourth orgasm of the night, but Roxas didn't stop just because of this little fact. In fact, he thrusted still faster, as he could feel his own orgasm coming on. "Fuck, pal." Roxas threw his head back, and growled as he started slamming his hips against his wife's ass, while his cock began to viciously pulsate. "I'm coming, Tilda." Roxas gave a loud groan of pleasure as he came, shooting his third, and largest, load of the night inside his wife's asshole, and Palutena moaned loudly as she received it. As Roxas finally finished coming inside Palutena, he pulled out of her, and flopped onto his bed, with Palutena joining him. "Man," Roxas panted, as Palutena shifted herself close to her husband, and cuddled with him, while he felt his cock slowly going down, in terms of hardness. "Was that a fun time, love?" "You bet," Palutena replied, kissing Roxas deeply on the lips. "You never cease to amaze me with your huge cock, Tilda." He. Roxas chuckled slightly, as he stroked Palutena's hair. After a moment or two of doing this, while basking in the afterglow of such great sex, Palutena moved away from him. "Hey, what are you doing?" "Well, I'm still feeling a little bit horny, Rox." The naked Palutena addressed her husband with the abbreviated version of his name, like he did with her sometimes. "I'm sure you'll be happy to tend to me, right, Tilda?" "Oh, yeah," Roxas replied, as Palutena grabbed the duvet with one hand and threw it into a corner of the room, to join her clothes, and Roxas's clothes. And for that, Palutena took hold of Roxas's cock, which was rather flaccid, and began slowly jerking it off. "We're gonna need a nice, hard, dick, Tilda." It would be multiple hours before Roxas and Palutena managed to get to sleep. Lemon ends here. Line break. Good evening, Father, mother. Roxas Gremory greeted his parents as he walked into the dining room of Sirzechs' private residence, after coming out of a transportation circle, in the aftermath of visiting a friend's house. He jumped up to his seat, where there was already a plate of food. He began to eat, as Grayfia and Sirzechs both greeted their son. "How were your friends, Roxas?" Sirzechs asked. "Were you okay? Was there any problems?" "I was fine, father." "You don't have to worry." Roxas replied after swallowing his mouthful. "But I do." Sirzechs replied. "I'm your father, of course I have to worry about you." "Have a little faith, Sirzechs." Grayfia gently chided her husband, in the warm voice she usually used in private. The silver-eyed beauty gently kissed her second-born son on the forehead, and went back to her meal, in quiet, yet comfortable and homely, silence. Sirzechs finished his dinner first, and stood up, clearing his plate away. He kissed Grayfia, and as he received a magic circle call on his ear, left the room in order to take it. The Crimson Satan gently touched the magic circle at his ear, and spoke aloud. "Hello. Sirzechs." The current Lucifer heard Ajuka Beelzebub's voice, which seemed to be both rather happy and rather, scratch that, really tired. "I've finished creating the transportation circle." "Really?" Sirzechs replied, raising his voice due to his sudden excitement. "You've finished the circle, and can get to Roxas." "I have." Ajuka replied. Sirzechs then heard a stifled yawn from his green-haired best friend's end of the line. "Come over here as fast as you can." Quote. "I will." Sirzechs replied. "Ajuka, have you been working on that thing all night?" "You know I didn't ask you." The magic circle connection was cut. By Ajuka. Sirzechs sighed at his friend, who was much more of a workaholic than he was when it came to his hobby, which was creation, and after remembering exactly what was said in the brief interaction between him and his best friend, rushed back into the dining room, taking Grayfia and Roxas by surprise. "Grayfia." Sirzechs called, urgently. "What?" Grayfia replied. "What's got you so uncharacteristically worked up?" "I just got a call from Ajuka." Sirzechs replied. "He's finished the transportation circle." Grayfia's eyes widened, as she hurriedly got to her feet. "You mean the one that big bro Roxas went through?" Roxas asked. He had been filled in about Roxas Gremory, from how he was the second heir of the Gremory household behind Sirzechs grew up in the aftermath of the Devil's Civil War, to his unexplained disappearance just over 2 centuries ago. "Can I come and see him?" "No." Sirzechs replied, instantly. "I'm sorry, Roxas, but you can't come with us. Not the first time, at least, as we don't know what's on the other side of the transportation circle, or how safe it will be for you, our son." Quote. Roxas replied. "I really wanted to meet my big bro, though. You can meet him next time we go." "We promise, Roxas." Grayfia replied, with a slightly hard look at Sirzechs, who gave a nod. "But for now, we're going to have to leave you with your grandparents." "Okay." Roxas whined a little, but complied as Grayfia took him through a transportation circle, and straight into the foyer of the Gremory Manor, which, on its own, could probably fit the entire private home of Sirzechs Lucifer in it, 3 times over. Maybe even 4 or 5. As they came in, a woman came walking out of one of the many doors that branched off to other parts of the Gremory Manor. Roxas's grandmother, and Grayfia's mother-in-law, the lady of the Gremory clan, Nephalem of Gremory, née Baal. Venelana was an incredibly beautiful woman, in her late 20s to early 30s, with back-length soft brown hair, violet eyes, and a buxom figure, which could be comparable to Grayfia's own size. Her hips were wide, and she wore a formal-looking purple dress with high slits. "Oh, Grayfia, Roxas." Venelana greeted the two of them. "This is a pleasant surprise. Why didn't you tell me and Sirzechs you were coming? What's going on?" A male voice asked, and someone came walking out of the same door. Grayfia's father-in-law, and Roxas's grandfather, Sirzechs Gremory. Sirzechs appeared to be a middle-aged-looking man who was handsome. He had long, crimson hair that went down to his back, and was tied in a loose ponytail with a black hairband. He wore standard noble devil's attire. "Lord Sirzechs, Lady Venelana, I apologize for the sudden intrusion." Grayfia bowed before the heads of the clan she was employed by. "But I need you to watch Roxas. Sirzechs and I have something that we need to do." "Oh, we'll take good care of him." Venelana replied. "Don't worry, Grayfia. We won't let Roxas out of our sight for a moment, just like Sirzechs always gets so worked up about." Grayfia sighed. Yes, Sirzechs is always overprotective of those he is related to. "First Roxas, then Rias, now Roxas." She replied. "I simultaneously see where he is coming from, and think that he needs to lay off it a bit." Sirzechs shrugged. "Anyway, Grayfia, you can be assured that Roxas will be fine with us." He waved. Go and do what you and Sirzechs need to do. When can we expect you to come back? I don't know. Grayfia replied, honestly. But if I had to guess, we'd probably be a full day. Sirzechs and Venelana both nodded as Grayfia left via magic circle. Line break. Unlike the day before, Roxas didn't have to worry about the intense rays of the Menorca sunlight penetrating his eyelids as he woke up in the morning. That was because the sunlight was blocked by one thing. That one thing being Palutena's beautiful, pale, slightly sweaty, naked body, a product of the previous night's events. It was still a mystery to Roxas as to how Palutena, given her parentage, could be such a freak in the sheets. Palutena gave an asleep grunt, and subconsciously pulled Roxas closer to her, leaving him within 2 inches of her large breasts. As he saw the smooth orbs of godly, quite literally, flesh right in front of him, Roxas's perverted side suddenly took control, and he stuck his tongue out, licking one of Palutena's nipples. Ah! Palutena's cute moan was music to Roxas's ears, as she opened her green eyes, which were just as deep in emerald color as her hair was, and looked down at her silver-haired husband. Morning, Roxas. Did you do that on purpose? You bet your horny ass that I did. Roxas replied. Your tits are just too amazing not to lick. But did you have to do it? Palutena asked, pouting down at her husband. I was in the middle of an amazing dream about having a child with you. He'd have your hair, my eyes, and all our powers. He'd be our own little powerful godly devil Tilda. Including 100% compatibility with a holy sword that you created for my personal use and my personal use only. Roxas asked, with a raised eyebrow. Palutena stared down at her husband for a second before relenting. Okay, maybe not that specific power, but you get what I mean. She replied. And besides, wouldn't it be wonderful to have a child that we can call our very own, Roxas? I've wanted one ever since before we got married. Me too, to be fair. Roxas replied. It's just my fucking devil side that makes me as infertile as a castrated guy. Oh, I wouldn't say you were entirely as infertile as that. Palutena replied. At least you can actually use your dick. Which is better for all of us Tilda. Yeah. Roxas replied, as he tried to shift himself from Palutena's grip, but to no avail. Anyway. We just have to keep trying. You'll knock me up someday. Maybe before our 100th anniversary Tilda. Fair enough. Roxas replied, as Palutena finally let him go, let him get out of bed. The silver-haired Nephalem instantly went to the pile that was the pile of clothes that he had discarded, when he had decided to do some meditation, the night before, next to the discarded dress that Palutena usually wore. A minute or so later, he was dressed, and 2 minutes after that 1 minute, after threatening Palutena with no sex that night if she didn't get her lazy divine Christian Greco ass out of bed, Palutena was dressed, too. Husband and wife both walked down to the dining room together, and saw Valian and Asia in the kitchen part of the dining room. There was only a counter table with stools pulled up to it, rather than anything fancy cooking some breakfast. Morning, Val. Roxas greeted the current host of Albion. When did you get back? Valian looked up. Hey, Roxas. Valian replied. And I just got back this morning. I met Asia cooking breakfast all on her own, and decided I'd pitch in and help. Cooking breakfast all on her own. Roxas raised a silver eyebrow, as he recalled how it had turned out when he tried to cook on his own. What the hell? Nuns in the Catholic Church were basically the servants of the men. Palutena explained to her husband. They had to cook, clean, do pretty much everything. And in the meantime, it was pray every day away. She looked at Asia. Though I can imagine that Asia's life, as the former holy maiden, was different from Thag. Yes, it was. Asia replied, as she looked up from her cooking. Though I was people would come from all over for me to heal them with my twilight healing, which I loved. I just loved helping people. Twilight healing, huh? Palutena asked, before giggling. Well. That's the first time I've met a host of the sacred gear of my creation. Huh? Asia blinked. I thought all sacred gears were created by your father. Most were. 12 of the 13 Longinus are. Palutena replied. However, I had a hand in creating some of them. She held a hand up, and started counting down the 5 sacred gears that she had created. Twilight healing, blade blacksmith, holy resuscitation, trick vanish, and incinerate anthem. She then held her hands up, and the same 2 silver rings, each with a blue-green gem on each ring, appeared. I have complete mastery of my copy of Twilight Healing. Palutena remarked. If you want, I can help you with your copy. Thank you. Asia smiled, before returning to the cooking. That'd be really nice. Well, Palutena's a really nice person. Roxas replied. Hey, Val. Is Akasha around? No. Valian replied. I just caught her as I was leaving. She said she had to go back to Romania. Something to do with the Carmilla faction. Roxas nodded. Arrogant pricks. He thought. I wish they'd just shut up and recognize that I'm Akasha's husband. Though they're not as bad as Hera. Single quote. The silver-haired Nephalem scowled, momentarily, at the recollection of Palutena's mother, and the most horrible woman he had ever met. Seriously, just because Palutena was a child she'd had with Bible God rather than with Zeus, it didn't mean she had to be such a coup. Hey, Roxas. Valian clicked her fingers in front of Roxas's face. Breakfast. She took a plate from Asia and placed it in front of Roxas, who had sat down. Roxas hurriedly thanked Valian, and took a few bites. Damn. Quote. He muttered. Asia, this is great. Asia blushed slightly from Roxas's praise. Thank you, Roxas. The blonde nun replied. I'm happy that such a high member of heaven likes it. Asia, I don't rank high in heaven at all. Roxas replied, calmly. I'm just a 10-winged Nephalem that happens to be the husband of the daughter of God. If anything, Palutena should be the high-ranking member of heaven. Didn't Michael offer to let you take over as the center of your father's system, pal? He did, but I turned it down. Palutena replied, as she stared eating her morning meal. I'd have to spend all of my time in heaven maintaining the system, and the lack of time spent with my husband would wreck me. I don't want that life. Roxas grinned, and pressed his lips against Palutena's. The two of them continued to eat their breakfast, later joined by Valian and Asia after insistence from Palutena that she eat with them. As in Roxas's house, everyone was equal, which prompted Roxas to make a communism joke. After breakfast was finished, Valian left, after a call from Azazel regarding ultimate class stray devil that had wandered into Gregory territory in mainland Spain. Valian was the head of Gregory's stray hunters crew, soon followed by Asia, who was taken to an all-purpose clothing store in heaven by Palutena, who had remarked that it wouldn't be good for Asia to only have a nun outfit for clothing, leaving Roxas alone. Well. The silver-haired Gremory thought to himself. Guess I could just relax today. And get around to finishing Assassination Classroom. Line break. A crimson magic circle quickly opened in the main part of Ajuka Beelzebub's laboratory, and the exhausted Ajuka looked up as Sirzechs and Grayfia came out of it. It was honestly difficult for the green-haired Satan to tell who looked more urgent to get going. Oh, hey Sirzechs. Grayfia. Ajuka yawned, blearily seeing his best friend and his wife. Sorry. I'm really tired. He yawned again. You know you didn't have to go and create the transportation circle in one night, Ajuka. Sirzechs said. You are allowed to sleep, you can now. Grayfia had grabbed Sirzechs' ear and was pulling it. A dangerously cold aura seeped from her body that scared Sirzechs down to the bone. Are you saying that our firstborn son is more important than your friend, Sirzechs? Grayfia asked, pulling harder, and infusing some of her demonic power into her hand, making it hurt even more. And no. Sirzechs began to sweat from the fear and pain. It hurts, Grayfia. Grayfia gave a sigh, and let go of Sirzechs' face. She then looked at Ajuka. The transportation circle, Ajuka. Ah, yes. Ajuka yawned, leading Sirzechs and Grayfia through a set of doors into a room with a machine that consisted of a large metal platform with the transportation circle on it, that was hooked up to a computer that had someone typing into it. The person that was typing was a tall, lanky old man around the age of 70. He had long legs and arms, and was very skinny. He had a dimly tanned, ashy complexion and spiky gray-blue hair, with a bald spot on the back of his head. He had a unibrow, above a pair of gray eyes. His face was wrinkly as he had bags under his eyelids and a pressure fold above his unibrow that followed its position, and laugh lines on both sides of his mouth. He wore a white lab coat with a light blue-green shirt underneath. He also wore brown pants, a dark brown belt with yellow buckle, and black shoes. Rick, how long can you keep the circle open for? Ajuka asked his queen. About 3 miles newts. Rick replied, belching as he spoke. Flecks of spit and alcohol left his mouth as he spoke. Come on. The power's draining Fr gasped. Well, you heard him. Ajuka yawned, pointing to the machine. Shall I come with you, Sirzechs? No, Ajuka. Sirzechs replied, walking forward and up to the machine, with Grayfia following. When Akuka made to protest, Sirzechs spoke again. Just us two, Ajuka. Sirzechs pleaded with his best friend. I know you love Roxas, but I think it'd be best if his parents were the first to meet him. Very well. Ajuka replied, as he stood aside. He yawned again. Plus. Sirzechs replied. You're knackered. Go and rest. Please. Ajuka nodded, and left the room, while Rick finished typing into the machine. Sirzechs and Grayfia stepped onto the transportation circle, which glowed green, then flashed, making Sirzechs and Grayfia disappear. A second later, Sirzechs and Grayfia came out of the magic circle and looked around. Unlike in the Underworld, where it was the beginning of dusk, the sun was high in the sky, and smiling bright upon the island that the current Lucifer and his wife happened to be on. In front of them stood a large, luxurious-looking, very modern, three-story villa. Grayfia and Sirzechs looked at each other, and slowly stepped forward, their hope for seeing their firstborn son again rising higher with every second. Line break. You gonna be back soon? Roxas asked of his wife through his phone. Quote. MMHMM. Yay, I don't mind. Just don't be too late, you know how bad I am at cooking. I know. Later. Quote. Roxas ended the call with Palutena, and as he finished the second season finale of Assassination Classroom, what an amazing show it was, he felt nature calling, and decided that now would be a good time to go and take a shit. He went to his bedroom's ensuite bathroom. All the bedrooms in his house featured ensuite bathrooms, and did his business. While he did his thing, Roxas felt a familiar pulse inside him, that told him that the wards that protected his house from intruders had been breached. However, when he ran a scan, that checked whether the wards, which insisted of protections involving layers of devil magic, angel magic, fallen angel magic, white magic, black magic, vampire magic, Norse magic, and dragon slayer magic, he found that they were still 100% operational. It seemed that rather than the wards being destroyed, whoever had breached them had just passed through them. Nothing more and nothing less. Roxas thought to himself. Seems that whoever breached those wards must be pretty skilled in magic, if they were able to get through all 40 layers of wards. As Roxas cleaned himself up and slowly walked to the front door of his house, he considered pulling out his special weapon. If Roxas wasn't already strong enough without his special weapon, then any being, even a super devil like Sirzechs, would have been hard-pressed to stop him in battle when he had his weapon in his hand. He was certainly no slouch with it, if by the term, no slouch, one meant that he was skilled enough to have trained Mr. Durandal, the violence of heaven, and the church's device of violence, Vasco Strada himself, the only full-blooded human who Roxas acknowledged as being able to challenge him in battle, in everything he knew, that is. And in any case, if whatever powerful individual had breached the wards, then it was a very real opportunity that he would need to take a forceful option in getting them to leave. Even if it meant pulling out the special weapon that Palutena had crafted for his personal use. The silver-haired Nephalem pulled open the door to his villa, and stepped out, ready to fight at a second's notice. However, when he saw who was stood outside, any desire to attack died faster than Belzar did when he cut his head off while the strongest boosted gear wielder was in Juggernaut drive mode. Sirzechs and Grayfia were stood outside, and they looked as shocked to see their firstborn son as he was to see them. There was an uncomfortable silence for half a minute, as Roxas looked at Sirzechs and Grayfia looked back at him. Speaking of Grayfia, she was the one to break the silence. Roxas. Why, you're here, you're alive, the silver-haired maid had tears in her eyes. My baby. Yeah, I'm here. Roxas replied. And you're here, too. Not knowing the concept of knocking instead of just teleporting into my. Roxas's words fell on deaf ears as Grayfia strode forward, and tightly wrapped her arms around her son, as if she was scared that he'd fade away in her arms. You can't even imagine how horrible it was for me and your father. Grayfia whispered, tearfully. When you disappeared without a trace, we thought we'd lost you forever. Oh, Roxas. She proceeded to cry into her son's shoulder, as Sirzechs spoke up, slightly awkwardly. Roxas, the Crimson Satan spoke. You're looking different, all grown up. You look just like your old man. I rather think I look more like Grayfia than you, father. Roxas replied. Apart from the stick in between my legs. Sirzechs chuckled, awkwardly, and even Grayfia let out a tearful giggle. She dried her eyes, and looked up at Roxas. Is this your house, Roxas? She asked. It's very nice. Thanks. And yes, it is mine. Roxas replied. Do you want to come in? Of course. Sirzechs replied. But Roxas, you've got some serious explaining to do. Chapter 4. Anything you recognize isn't mine. Sue. Roxas remarked, as Sirzechs and Grayfia took seats on his sofa, and he walked over to the kitchen part of his house. Want anything to drink? Sorry, but I've only got water. That would be welcome. Sirzechs replied. And I'm okay with water. Grayfia added that she would be okay with water as well, which Roxas nodded to. The silver-haired Nephalem got 2 glasses, filled them up with water from the tap, and grabbed himself a can of Coca-Cola. Holding the can up behind his back with magic, in a similar way to telekinesis, he'd recently started learning how to apply his demonic magic in a telekinetic way, but could only do it to a basic level, and holding the two glasses with his hands, he walked back into the living room, and handed his parents the glasses of water. Grayfia took a sip, and smiled. "Thank you, Roxas," the maid said. "I must say, it's nice to see you're being hospitable to your parents after 2 centuries. Quote. MMMHMM. Roxas replied, moving the can of soft drink out from behind his back, catching it, opening it, and half emptying it down his throat. Sirzechs was the first to notice, and spoke up. "Hey, Roxas. I thought you said you had water." "Yeah, I did. And I do," Roxas replied, calmly. For parents who rudely teleport through wards, and essentially break into their son's house. Quote. Roxas took satisfaction in the fact that Sirzechs and Grayfia had it in them to look slightly awkward, and a little ashamed of themselves. "We're sorry, Roxas," Grayfia replied. "We were just so overcome with wanting to see our oldest son again, that I and your father would go through any lengths to do it." Roxas sighed. "Whatever," he replied. "Doesn't change the fact that you're here, and will probably come back after a while if I sent you away." "Yeah, we probably would have." Quote. Sirzechs replied. As Grayfia glared at him, he hurriedly added. "Or at least, I would have." Grayfia just sighed. Evidently, that wasn't the right thing to say. "Anyway, Roxas, I must commend you on the layers of your wards." It took a Juka, someone who was responsible for breaking through the wards on the Valifor castle, an act that essentially won the anti-Satan faction the Devil's Civil War, 24 full hours, without sleep, with his queen's help, to create a transportation circle that broke through them. Roxas shrugged. "Okay," he replied. "Anyway, what are you doing here?" "What kind of a question is that, Roxas?" Grayfia asked, slightly intensely, and quicker than she meant to, in reply. "The kind that, wasn't meant to attack or hurt you in any way, and b, the kind that you're supposed to answer without doing a Shakespeare, Mom." Roxas replied. "Well, Roxas, we just want to know." Grayfia trailed off, before looking down at her knees, sighing, and looking back up at Roxas. "Why?" she asked, with more confidence and emotion in her voice than ever. "Why did you just disappear on us, for 2 centuries, without giving us any reason or warning? What excuse have you got for putting us through that kind of hell of thinking that you were dead and gone ever since 1812? Hey. Direct as ever, Mom." Roxas replied, sitting down. "Well, there are a couple of reasons I left, but can I first start by saying, hand on heart, that I had every intention of returning to the Gremory family." "I sure hope you did," Sirzechs replied. "Before you tell us, Roxas, can we start by saying that no matter what you tell us, we won't be angry with you. We, as your parents, can understand, and after we've cleared this business up, we can return to the Gremory Manor. Reunite with the rest of your family." Roxas replied. "Well, Dad, you kinda landed on a large part of why I left in the first place. The House of Gremory itself." Sirzechs blinked. "I'm sorry. Did I stutter, Dad?" Roxas asked. "You heard me right." He sighed, and sat down, opposite his parents. "If I had a penny for every time I heard the words, House of Gremory, when I was a child, then I could probably bribe my way into becoming the president of Russia. And that's with all the money I would have earned before I turned 18. "What are you talking about, Roxas?" Sirzechs asked. "What I'm talking about, is that the House of Gremory was all that ever was talked about, at least where I was concerned." Roxas replied. "Ever since the start, all my upbringing, how I appeared to the outside, everything I had to do, everything I was taught, was all in the name of being a perfect future head of the Gremory clan, while everything else was second priority to Sirzechs and Venelana. If it was a priority at all, that is." Sirzechs and Grayfia looked at each other, then back at Roxas, understanding what he was talking about. As Sirzechs was the current Lucifer, in the opening decades of the era of devils under the rule of the 4 current Satans being himself, Seraphol Leviathan, Ajuka Beelzebub, and Fianna Asmodeus, he would be too busy to be a father to Roxas, and Grayfia, as someone who worked a job as the head maid of the Gremory clan, a job that required 12 to 17 hours a day, 6 days a week, of making sure that the Gremory Manor was taken properly care of, would suffer a similar fate. Sirzechs had requested that Sirzechs and Venelana Gremory, his parents, be the ones to take care of Roxas, which they, along with Grayfia, had agreed to. Grayfia had only agreed on the condition that she be able to see her son at least once a day, which Sirzechs and Venelana had agreed to. Sirzechs also made his best efforts to see Roxas whenever he could, though there were times where he was unable to, given that he was, well, I don't like repeating myself, so I won't. While I know that my grandparents, who were the ones to bring me up, really. Roxas continued talking. I never felt like my voice was being heard, and I had no choice to do anything. Even in what food I ate. What the fuck is up with that? Grayfia opened her mouth to admonish her son for using such bad language, but shut it. She didn't want to interrupt her son as he talked. Well, anyway, though I acknowledge the time I had away from that with you, Mom, and sometimes you as well, Dad, as the only times I could think I was being listened to, even if you were both incredibly determined to make sure, 10,000 times over, that I was absolutely safe. Sorry to sound selfish, but it wasn't enough. Roxas kept talking. I looked on the few low and mid-class devils that lived outside the jurisdiction of the 72, or rather, 33, pillars, and felt jealous at the freedom they had. I was jealous at how no one really told them what to do, and upon seeing that, I started resenting, then hating, then outright loathing the entire concept of being the heir to the House of Gremory, if I couldn't have the freedom that others were allowed to have. Roxas downed the rest of his drink, as he continued. Well, like the low-class devils had, I started craving my own life, one that I had my own say, and 100% choice in how it went, not one that was planned out by my grandparents. I didn't want my entire life to be dictated, who I got with, how I was taught how to fight in battle, how I should approach certain situations, and so, after managing to circumnavigate yours, Zeoticus, Venelanas, Seraphals, Ajukas, and even Fianas, to an extent, efforts, I left. So, you asked. Quote. Grayfia and Sirzechs were both silent as Roxas finished his little speech, and both were having certain feelings. Grayfia, on one hand, felt both a sense of finality, as she'd finally gotten the reason of Roxas's leaving out of him. And she, 100%, believed him, as though he was a lot of things, he was not a liar. The ultimate queen also felt immense internal joy, as she'd just found out that, contrary to what she herself believed, Roxas didn't leave because he hated his parents. I understand, Roxas. Grayfia replied. I'm deeply sorry that you thought that we were being overbearing on you, but you have to appreciate that this was our first time being parents to a child, and I do appreciate that. Roxas replied. I forgive you, Mom. Sirzechs, hemphed. So you left because you didn't appreciate mine and Grayfia's best efforts to be there for you when we could, Roxas. You sound like you're ungrateful for all we tried to do for you. Sirzechs. Grayfia spoke, with a warning tone. Weren't you listening to anything Roxas said? There were reasons beyond us that Roxas decided to leave us. And besides, we're doing a better job of being parents to Milikas, so there's no chance of it happening again, right? Right. Sirzechs replied, taking a breath and looking up at Roxas, who still looked between Grayfia and Sirzechs, his calm expression still on his face. It's fine, Mom. I understand Dad's way of thinking. In fact, I'm honestly surprised that you aren't coming to the same conclusion that he did. He then turned to Sirzechs, and focused on him. Dad. I've said it before, I'll say it again. You're not the only reason I left, and though you were a part of it, I don't hold anything against you as a person. I still acknowledge that for the small part of your life that you were able to see me, you were a great father. I see. Sirzechs replied, nodding. Well, now that that's out of the way, I have a question for you, Roxas. Yes. Roxas replied. Well, now that we know why you left, would you mind telling us what you were doing while you were gone? Sirzechs asked. You seem extremely different from before when you left. You're a lot taller, and more muscular, too. Have you been working out? Well, in a sense. Roxas replied. I much prefer to call it training, but to each their own, I suppose. Apart from wanting independence from a clan that was far too strict and organized in bringing me up as the heir to a clan, and not a powerful devil. Again, sorry to sound selfish, but it's true. No, we understand, Roxas. Sirzechs replied, holding a calming hand up. Devils are selfish by nature, so we understand your wishes. Roxas grinned. All right, then. The silver-haired Nephalem replied. Though, there's something else that's happened while I've been on my travels. Something you might want to know. Okay. Grayfia replied. What is it? Well. Roxas replied, slightly guiltily. Now that he was about to tell his parents, it seemed to have suddenly become a lot harder for him to do so. I'm married. 2 glasses shattered at the exact same time, from Grayfia and Sirzechs having dropped them at the exact same time. The Crimson Satan and the silver-haired Queen of Annihilation stared at their son, in abject amazement, while Roxas waited for his parents to recover from the obvious shock by idly looking up at a poster on the wall that depicted a certain greatest drummer of all time doing his thing, with the simple caption of, Forever, written on the bottom, while also waving his hand to pick the broken pieces of glass up, and mend them back into normal glass cups, clean up the water spilled, and return the glasses to the kitchen. Roxas looked back at Grayfia and Sirzechs, who looked like their brains had done a full factory reset, but didn't mean that they were no less shocked. Am married. Grayfia stammered, in shock. You. Really? Yeah. Roxas replied, seeing no reason whatsoever to sugarcoat it. I'm married. But. Grayfia composed herself, then walked over to Roxas and grabbed his ear. Hard. How could you have gotten married without us being there? Grayfia asked, a dark killing intent seeping from her body. Didn't you know that it was the greatest desire of our lives, to see our firstborn son getting married to the woman he loved? She shook Roxas's ear slightly as she held it in an iron grip, while infusing some of her demonic power into it to make it hurt more. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Why yes, actually. Roxas replied, through the pain, and focused a small, but potent, light spell into his left ear, the one that Grayfia was holding onto, making his mother hiss slightly in pain and let go of his ear. Roxas then rubbed his ear, and stood up. I wanted to invite you to my wedding. Believe me, I did. But I decided against it because you two, amongst others, would have tried to drag me back to the underworld, where I belonged. And another thing, Mom. Roxas opened a magic circle with his hand, reached into it, and began to rummage around in it for a second. I know it's in here somewhere. He muttered, reaching deeper and deeper into the circle, before he triumphantly crowed, here we are. And pulled something out, a memory stick. Here you go. He tossed the memory stick to Sirzechs, who caught it. It's got the video that I put together of my wedding on it, in case you ever came asking for it. He remarked, before his voice became slightly sardonic for a moment. Maybe you can make a reaction video on YouTube about it, Mom. It'd be bound to get popular for certain reasons. His red eyes flicked to his mother's ample figure for a second, before looking back at her face. I see. Grayfia replied, either having missed the meaning of Roxas's remark entirely, or showing no reaction to the fact that she had gotten the meaning of Roxas's remark. Thank you, Roxas. I'll make sure to watch it. I will, as well. Sirzechs added, smiling. Thank you for thinking of us like this. Roxas replied, shrugging, as Grayfia put the memory stick in her own magical storage space. Anything else you want to ask? Oh, yes. Grayfia replied. Roxas, who are you married to? I'd love to meet her, if you wouldn't mind. Oh, I wouldn't. Roxas replied. Is this girl a devil, Roxas? Sirzechs asked, slightly excitedly. What's she like? Well, Roxas began, but at that exact moment, the door to his house opened, and Palutena stood in the doorway. She seemed to be in the process of magically changing her clothes back to her signature white dress. Roxas noticed that she seemed to be changing it from a red crop top and jeans. Oh. She said, noticing the scene before her. Am I interrupting anything? Not at all, Palutena. Roxas replied. In fact, you're right on cue. Where's Asia? Oh, I just teleported her back to your room. Palutena replied. So she could try on some of the clothes we brought. Fair enough. Roxas replied, as his green-haired wife walked into the room, and sat down beside him, resting her head on his shoulders. Roxas then looked up at Sirzechs and Grayfia. Well, you asked. And here she is, my wife. Only known Christian Greco deity to date, daughter of Hera, present queen of Olympus and Greek goddess of marriage, and the biblical god, Yahweh, Palutena. Palutena, who had to suppress a snigger at the looks on Sirzechs and Grayfia's faces, which were those of shock, gave a calm, kindly smile to Roxas's parents, and her parents-in-law. Grayfia recovered first, and spoke to one of the few female beings she knew of who she, the sole daughter of Lucifer and Lilith, was guaranteed to lose against if she were to fight them, one-on-one. I see. She took a breath, as Palutena looked calmly at her and Sirzechs. Palutena, I hope my son hasn't caused you any trouble. Oh, Roxas hasn't caused me any trouble at all, Grayfia Lucifuge. Palutena replied, with her smile taking on a more humorous tint. I must say, it's rather ironic for the daughter of the biblical god himself, and the grandson of the old Lucifer, who is also the son of the new Lucifer, to get married, isn't it? Why yes, it is. Sirzechs replied. Well, I don't think I have any more questions for you, Roxas. Good to know. Roxas replied, calmly. But I'm quite sure that your grandparents will. Sirzechs replied, leaning forward, a slight smile on his face. Hopefully, you can come with us back to the Gremory Manor, and talk things out with your grandparents. Maybe, you can even retake your place as the true Gremory heir, as you never truly surrendered the title to Rias. Oh, but I do. Roxas replied. 1. I don't care who takes the title of Gremory heir, but I don't want it to be me. 2. Didn't you hear that I hate the idea of being the heir to the Gremory clan, due to how Zeodicus and Venelana chose to raise me? And, finally, 3. Be realistic, Dad. Who do you think Zeodicus and Venelana would accept as their heir? Their daughter, my aunt, who loves the idea of being the Gremory heir, and is perfectly content with keeping the title. Or their grandson, who loathes the idea of being the Gremory heir, and... Quote. Roxas then stood up, and spread his 10 pure white devil wings, making Sirzechs and Grayfia gasp, in unison. Quote. Who just so happens to be a Nephalem? Palutena couldn't take it. She burst out laughing at the looks on Sirzechs and Grayfia's faces, which were even more shocked than when Roxas had revealed the identity of his wife. Sirzechs tried to speak, but seemed to have forgotten how to. Roxas, why? Roxas swore that he could see smoke rising from Sirzechs' head, as his brain began to short-circuit. Grayfia was having an easier time of processing the fact that Roxas was the first Nephalem, the species that had perfect control over both demonic and angelic powers, along with the potential to become more powerful than either species, and possibly to power levels attained by gods, or god-class beings. And given that Roxas possessed 10 wings, the same number of wings as Grayfia herself, it definitely seemed that he'd hit such a level. You're not upset, are you? Roxas asked. Oh, no. Grayfia replied, standing up, walking over to Roxas, and enveloping him in a caring hug. It's a lot to take in. That your firstborn son, who you've been looking for over 200 years, is so different from when you last saw him. She looked longingly into Roxas's face, which looked like a perfect, yet male, carbon copy of her own. How did you become a Nephalem? I'd like to know that myself. Sirzechs, who seemed to have also recovered, replied, as his eyes shifted from his wife and son, to Palutena. Though I think I have a feeling that I know who is responsible for this. Palutena calmly shrugged. Guilty as charged, Sirzechs. She remarked. Yes, I was the one to turn my husband into a Nephalem. Though it was a bit different from what I originally wanted to turn him into. So, you're saying that you wanted to turn my son into an angel? Grayfia asked, her voice neutral, but killing intent slowly seeping from her. Originally, yes. Palutena replied. However, it was only the second time I had tried to use the power I'd inherited from my father, and create a being, and the first time that I'd tried it on an already living being. And, as you can see, the creation went slightly awry, and I ended up with a Nephalem for then-boyfriend instead of an angel. Mom, Dad. Roxas cut in, before Sirzechs and Grayfia could speak. I know what you're thinking. I was angry with Palutena for doing something like trying to change the species I belonged to without my consent at first, but I know that it came from good intentions, and it also fit in with my want to become stronger, and not be seen as just the son of the Crimson Satan and the strongest queen. After I realized that, I forgave Palutena, and even if I have to meditate every once in a while, I'm happier than I was before with who I am now. Quote. Sirzechs' response to what Palutena said died in his throat as he heard Roxas's speech, and he took a breath to calm himself down. All right. He relented. If you're happy with who you are, Roxas, then I'm happy too. And I'll support you. The Crimson Satan then proceeded to give a slightly goofy, yet no less fatherly, smile. Thanks, Dad. Roxas smiled in reply. Mom. I concur with your father, Roxas. Grayfia replied. I'm happy with who you are, and I'll support you, no matter what. Roxas smiled. Thank you, Mom. He replied. Now, I'm gonna go get a drink. My throat's real fucking dry from all this talking. The four beings all laughed, and Roxas went into the kitchen. As Grayfia and Palutena sat down on the sofa and started talking, Roxas pulled out another can of Coca-Cola, opened it, and drank a bit. Turning around to go back into the living room, he saw Sirzechs standing in the way. What is it now, Dad? He asked. Sirzechs looked slightly awkward for a second, before speaking. Roxas, I know you threw away your ability to be heir of the House of Gremory, thanks to becoming a Nephalem, he spoke, which I support, by the way. He quickly added, as Roxas looked sharply at him. But, will you at least temporarily come back to the Gremory Manor, only for a night or so, just to let your family know that you're alive? If not for them, then for Rias, and for Milikas. Milikas. Roxas blinked. Your little brother. Sirzechs replied. I'm sure your aunt and your little brother would love to meet you. Disregarding the fact that Rias and I have already met, and exchanged words. Roxas muttered, under his breath. Sure. He shrugged. It can't be worse than the time Palutena and I went to Olympus. But I'm only going under 2 conditions. Name them. Sirzechs said, instantly. He was extremely anxious to see Roxas come back to the Gremory Manor, and was willing to meet almost any condition that his eldest son could think of, if it meant that he could meet his family, which the Crimson Satan thought would be good for him. 1. Roxas held up his index finger. Palutena is coming with me. She's my wife, and deserves to come with me on such an important occasion. Fair enough. Sirzechs replied. I can arrange that. What is your second condition? Roxas held up his middle finger, as well as his index, and spoke. If Venelon or Zeoticus start speaking about the power of destruction, I'm in my full right to leave, and no one will be able to stop me. Why? Sirzechs asked, not antagonistically, but curiously. Do we have a deal or not? Roxas asked, his red eyes meeting Sirzechs' blue ones in a glare that was very similar to the one that Grayfia would give him when she wanted something. Sirzechs sighed. We do. He replied. Will you be able to come this time next week? I think so. Roxas replied. Though any times I visit the Gremory Manor beyond that will be my choice, and my choice alone. Very well. Sirzechs replied. He turned to leave the kitchen, but stopped, and turned back. Even if it's extremely surprising, some of the things I've learned about you today, Roxas. He said, quietly. It's been really good to see you again. Good to know. The silver-haired son of Sirzechs replied, accepting a hug from his father. Won't you be getting off, soon? Yes, hopefully. Sirzechs replied, as he and Roxas left the kitchen. 15 minutes later, Sirzechs and Grayfia were standing outside Roxas's house, with Roxas and Palutena in front of them. Goodbye, Roxas. Grayfia smiled at her son, giving him a kiss on the forehead. It's been great to see you again. Right back at you, Mom. Roxas replied. But one thing, before you go. He reached into his pocket, and passed Sirzechs and Grayfia a sheet of paper, with the sign of the Gremory crest on it. In case you ever come and visit me again. He explained. I don't want you sneaking through my wards again. Even if today's reunion was really nice. We'll make sure to use it. Sirzechs nodded. He made to activate his transportation circle, but stopped himself. Can we make copies of this, in case others want to come to your house and speak with you? I can think of at least 3 people who would want to see you again. I know which 3 people you're thinking of, and yeah, sure. Roxas replied. Just try and ask Seraphal to tone down her love for me when she inevitably comes. No promises. Sirzechs sniggered, as he activated the transportation circle, and he and Grayfia disappeared. Once they were gone, Roxas and Palutena re-entered his house, and sat down on the sofa. You know, Roxas. Palutena asked, her kindly smile still on her face. You have really, really nice parents. Her expression then became slightly more melancholy. Especially your mother. Quote. I know, love. Roxas replied, wrapping an arm around his wife and giving her a comforting hug, which she gladly returned. I know. Quote. Line break. Come on, you lazy little shits. Roxas shouted, sword made of light in hand, to a group of 15 or so exorcists, only 2 of which were still conscious, in the field behind a large church, all of whom had their own swords made of light. It was a surprise that George Lucas hadn't sued the shit out of the church yet, in hand, and were circling around Roxas, trying to find an opening to attack the Nephalem. I've seen snails move faster than you. I've seen elephants with better use of a sword, and that's more like it, Zenobia. Zenobia Quarta, one of the exorcists that Roxas was training, and one of the 2 exorcists that were still conscious, given the training he was putting them through today, had dashed forward with her own light sword, with surprising speed, and tried to slash Roxas's face with it. Zenobia was an attractive young woman with chin-length blue hair that had a dyed green fringe on the right side and brown eyes. She, like the other 3 female exorcists that Roxas was training today, wore a black, skin-tight short-sleeve unitard, with pauldrons, matching fingerless gloves that extended to her biceps, and thigh-high boots, all of which were adorned with straps. It was definitely attire that Roxas would appreciate a woman wearing while in the bedroom with him, but this was the church, so he had to try and show some restraint. Roxas quickly raised his own light sword to block Zenobia's attack, easily overpowered her, pulled a quick movement with his sword that sent Zenobia spinning from her hand, and grabbed her face. Roxas then proceeded to lift Zenobia into the air and slam her into the ground, face first, rendering her barely conscious, but unable to move. Though you really should work on learning how to take attacks. Roxas remarked, lightly rolling his neck around his shoulders. If I were a stray devil, or not holding back, you would be dead and your soul would be made into Hade's personal bitch. Quote. Zenobia. Irina Shido, another of the exorcists that Roxas was training that day, Irina's and Zenobia's boss, Griselda Quarta, had received an offer from the Seraph Gabriel to join up with her brave saints, so she couldn't be here to train these exorcists. Therefore, Michael had to call Roxas and ask him to fill in for her at the last moment. Cried. She, with slight more caution than Zenobia, tried to rush at Roxas as well. Irina was an attractive young woman, with chestnut hair and violet eyes. Her hair was tied into twin tails, held with a blue scrunchie. She wore the exact same attire as Zenobia. Roxas, without even looking, as Irina was running at him from behind, leant over backwards with such speed and agility that Irina didn't even know that her sword had missed Roxas until he pulled a backward somersault, propelling himself into the air. Roxas then delivered a mid-air kick to Irina's head, sending her sprawling into the ground, as Roxas landed lightly on it, and sniggered. Honestly, he remarked, slightly mockingly, as he dispelled his light sword. I'm quite surprised that 15 exorcists, the so-called agents of the wrath of God, couldn't even land a scratch on a so-called sinner like me in 2.5 hours of light training. It's quite pathetic. Quote. Why, you'd know a lot about being pathetic, wouldn't you, Nephalem? Zenobia asked, shakily getting to her feet and trying to walk, but stumbling. Says the person who can't even walk right now. Roxas retorted, as he heard 2 people walking towards him, and turned. Oh, hey. Didn't expect to see you back so soon, Griselda. And Vasco's here, too. Quote. Griselda Quarta, one of the top 5 female exorcists, was a very pretty woman in her late 20s or early 30s, with straight, shoulder-length golden blonde hair, and blue eyes. She wore the same attire as the 3 female exorcists that Roxas had trained, though it was under a white, hooded cloak. Vasco Strada, the strongest exorcist of all time, he had only attained this title weeks ago, as the former strongest exorcist of all time, Dulio Gaisaldo, had been turned into an angel by Michael, was a 2-meter-tall elderly man, 87 years of age, to be exact. He had white hair that had wrinkles on it, similar to that of a normal elderly. His body, despite his age, was extremely muscular. He had a thick neck, thick chest, thick arms and thick legs. If Roxas were to make an educated guess, he would say that Vasco had twice of his own muscle mass. Vasco also wore priest vestments. Hello, Roxas. Vasco politely greeted his friend, and the man who had trained him when he was a teenager and young adult. Or should I say, silver-haired Prince of Twilight. I hope you're doing well. Very well, violence of heaven. Roxas replied, walking over to Vasco and shaking his hand. Still keeping strong despite your age? I would think so. Vasco replied, kindly smiling down at the being who, despite appearing to only be a quarter of his age, was actually nearly 7 times his age, as well as the man who had trained him. Did you get my call about Asia? I did. Vasco replied, nodding. I'm glad to know that she now has a good home, with you in Palutena. Yeah. Roxas replied. Good to know that you trust me and my wife, since you're the only really high-ranked member of the church that does. Roxas and Vasco both shared a chuckle, before the Hey, Griselda. Roxas greeted the blonde. Did you take that offer to become an angel? I did. Griselda Quarta replied, revealing 6 pure white angel wings. I'm now the queen of Lady Gabriel. She looked at the exorcists that she was supposed to be training, and sighed. You broke them, didn't you? My Tilda, Roxas replied, grinning at the dark expression on Griselda's face, and then shrugging. Okay, maybe a little. That's what I thought. Griselda muttered, as she looked back at the exorcists, who were trying to bow to her, as an angel, and Vasco, as the cardinal priest of the Catholic Church, but couldn't, as Roxas had rendered them entirely incapable of doing so without falling over. It was quite comical, really. Anyway. Roxas remarked, looking at Vasco. Fancy having a spar, Vasco? He asked. I didn't even break a sweat after training these weaklings for over 2 hours, and I know that you can match me in a fight. Very well. Vasco replied, calmly walking forward, and cracking his knuckles, as Roxas removed his leather jacket, and dropped it on the ground beside him. Swords or fists? Fists. Roxas replied, getting into a battle stance. Though if you fancy pulling out your holy sword during this little bout, I'll be happy to pull out mine. Ah, I don't think that would be necessary. Vasco replied, as he got into his own battle stance, and disregarded the gazes of the other exorcists, who were getting to their feet, and looking upon their eminence, getting ready to fight. You little babies might want to stand back. Roxas remarked. Things are about to get fun. Quote. After about 5 seconds of the Nephalem and the exorcist circling each other, Roxas was the one to dash at Vasco, his fist raised. After a second, Vasco dashed towards Roxas as well, his own fist raised. When they reached each other, Roxas and Vasco swung at each other at the exact same time, and their fists collided with their faces at the exact same time. Neither Roxas nor Vasco flinched from the other's punch, and neither moved from their position until Vasco pulled a quick move, ducked down, grabbed Roxas by the leg, and flung him bodily into the air. Roxas righted himself just in time to raise his hands in order to block the follow-up punch of Vasco, who tried to jump up and attack him. The 2 combat masters landed on the ground, face to face or rather, neck to face, as Roxas only reached Vasco's chest, in terms of height, and started dashing around the field. When they stopped for the first time, Roxas tried to throw a punch at Vasco's midsection, but he blocked it, and threw a punch at his face, which Roxas sidestepped, and tried to punch Vasco in the side, which he took without flinching, and dashed off, with Roxas in hot pursuit. None of the exorcists watching the bout had a chance of seeing Roxas or Vasco as they moved around the field at top speed. Even Griselda's eyes had a hard time keeping up with them. Roxas reached Vasco, who had stopped moving, and tried to throw another punch at his midsection, which Vasco blocked with his arm, but didn't see coming the other fist that Roxas threw, knocking him slightly off balance. Roxas then swung at Vasco's face with his leg, and crashed against it, knocking Vasco flying, but the huge exorcist righted himself in midair, and landed on the ground. As Roxas dashed at Vasco again, and threw such a powerful punch that a sonic boom was heard going off for miles around, Vasco, in the nick of time, had pulled out a sword. When the smoke cleared from the sonic boom that Roxas had caused, he got an eyeful of it. It was a uniquely shaped broadsword with a blue blade and golden edge. The sword had a semicircular guard on the left side of the handle, that extended to the bottom just above the pommel, with a small extension on the right side of the handle. The blade looked rather small in Vasco's hands. This was Durandal, or, to be more specific, a replica of Durandal, that had only 20% of the power of the original sword. Vasco had been given the replica of Durandal by the Pope, as he was the original, and strongest, wielder, and the Church, according to Michael, had faith that Vasco would be able to draw out its maximum potential, to cut everything without exception, and attain much greater strength than was intended for the replica of one of the four great Christian holy swords Excalibur, Durandal, Ascalon and Caliburn, around 80%, if Roxas had to guess himself. Alright, so you decided to pull out that sword of yours. Roxas remarked, jumping back as Vasco got into a battle stance with his sword. Well, then. Time to pull out mine. Roxas, to everyone's surprise except Vasco's, grabbed his golden hairband, and pulled it out of his hair, letting his silver hair fly free in the wind. While holding it in his hand, the hairband turned into a sword. The sword had a long, silver blade, just over a meter in length with a middle part that faded from blue to silver. It didn't have a hand guard, instead, the sword's blade widened out slightly. There were blue designs at the bottom of the widened out part of the blade, and the handle was the same blue color. This was Excalibur Galatine, a holy sword created by Palutena for Roxas's personal use, based on the legendary holy sword, Excalibur. The sword possessed approximately all of the powers of, and approximately 75% of the strength of the original Excalibur, though like Vasco, Roxas was able to draw out the potential of his sword beyond its intended potential, and attain strength closer to 90% of the strength of the original Excalibur. Alright. Roxas grinned, getting into a battle stance himself. It's time that this battle started for real. Quote. Vasco and Roxas both jumped at each other at the exact same time, and landed within feet of each other. Vasco swung down to attack Roxas, but Roxas blocked his attack with his Excalibur, and made to swing around Vasco, but the replica of Durandal got in the way, so Roxas had to change course and backflip away from Vasco, landing to the other side of him. Roxas swung at Vasco's legs, but his attack was blocked, and when he jumped into the air to try and perform a flip attack on his former protege, he was blocked again as he landed back on the ground. Roxas and Vasco continued to exchange blows, at blistering speed, with the younger in terms of physical appearance, which gave him an edge over Vasco, and more acrobatic Roxas jumping and flipping around, Yoda style, to either dodge Vasco's powerful swings, attack, or give himself a future opening to attack, even if his attacks would be blocked, sometimes narrowly, sometimes easily, by Vasco. As Roxas came out from another of his flips, and landed behind Vasco, he swung downwards at him, but the white-haired cardinal priest turned around and swung in turn, with the two holy swords clashing with one another. Neither swordsman let up, neither were willing to let the other come out on top in this clash, but after 15 full seconds of pressing against each other, without either moving an inch, Roxas was the one to slowly overpower Vasco, and push his sword aside. The two opponents swung at each other, and as they clashed again, Roxas suddenly became invisible. Transparency. He's using one of Excalibur's 7 powers, to allow the blade and its wielder to become invisible. Vasco thought, as he stopped, and cast out his senses, hoping to catch a feeling of Roxas's magical signature, as that would tell him where he would come from next. After a second. Above. Vasco looked up and swung the Durandal replica in a wide arc, letting out a huge holy aura that impacted Roxas, and surprised him out of invisibility, and forced him backward. He landed on the ground, and Vasco noticed that instead of one, there were 5 Roxases rushing at him. Nightmare. Vasco thought, as he readied himself. Another of the 7 powers. To create illusions and manipulate dreams. Single quote. As far as he remembered, the illusion versions of Roxas wouldn't be able to hurt him if they hit him, as they were just that, illusions. Vasco pulled the same trick he'd done before with his Durandal replica, and sent a huge holy wave at the 4 clone Roxases and one real one, hoping that he'd be able to weed out the real Roxas so he could attack him. 4 of the Roxases were able to dodge the holy wave, either jumping over it or sliding beneath it, but one of them was not. He disappeared. 1 down. 3 to go. Vasco thought, as the 4 Roxases came from 4 different directions, and attacked Vasco at the same time. Vasco, in a surprising show of agility, jumped into the air, dodging all of the Roxases, and noticed that all but one, the real one, had disappeared. He landed on the ground with such force that he made the ground shake slightly and began to swing downwards at Roxas, who, in his state of ducking, swung upwards at Vasco at the exact same time. Both swords were milliseconds away from hitting their opponents when Griselda called out. Enough. Roxas and Vasco both stopped at the exact same time, and at the exact same time, they looked at Griselda, who had stepped forward. If the two of you keep going, you're gonna destroy this entire field. Griselda admonished Vasco and Roxas. Look at what you did earlier. She pointed, and Roxas followed her finger to see that the part of the field that he'd punched the Durandal replica, the part that he'd caused the sonic boom in, had been almost entirely uprooted. Ah, haha. Roxas shrugged. Sorry, Grizzly. Accident. Griselda facepalmed as Roxas used the nickname that she hated. Anyway, you'll also end up killing each other if you keep going for long. And I very highly doubt that my king would like the second highest official in the church, as well as her future husband, getting themselves killed in a simple spar. Whatever. Roxas replied, shrugging, as he turned Excalibur Galadine back into a golden headband, and retied his hair up, returning it to his preferred style of a ponytail. Also, there's nothing certain about me becoming the husband of the angel who currently holds the title of Angel of Death. Speaking of that, I would love to see her reaction to the song of the same name. Quote. Griselda, Vasco and the other exorcists had no reaction to this. Griselda and Vasco because they were probably too busy thinking about how Gabriel would react to the most controversial track that the American thrash metal band Slayer had ever put out, and the other exorcists because they probably had no idea what the hell Roxas was talking. Roxas, however, shrugged and created a transportation circle. See you later, Vasco, Grizzly. He bade Vasco and Griselda, who growled goodbye, and activated it. Line break. Roxas appeared back in his home, in the foyer of his house, yawning slightly to himself. From where he was able to see the silver hair of Valian, his first cousin once removed, draping over the back of the sofa, as she watched BoJack Horseman on TV. Hey, Val. Roxas remarked, as he walked into the house. Good to see you're back. How was your mission? Same to you. Valian replied, as she heard Roxas walking towards her, while not taking her eyes off the huge TV. My mission was interesting. In what way? Roxas asked, before speaking a second later. Hey, whatever. He walked past Valian, looking at her. You can tell me what happened, later. Roxas trailed off as he looked past Valian to see a new woman lying lazily on the sofa. The woman was certainly beautiful and attractive, with a voluptuous figure on a similar level to Valian's, long black hair that was tied up, with split bangs, and hazel gold eyes with cat-like pupils. She wore a black kimono, a yellow obi, a set of golden beads, and an ornately detailed headband. The kimono featured a red interior, and was open at her shoulders, giving view to her very large breasts. A more exotic feature of this woman was that she had a pair of black cat ears on her head, and two black tails growing from her back. Valian. Roxas said, his voice slightly forced. Care to explain? Why there is a stray devil in my house. Valian sighed, and swiveled herself around on the sofa to face Roxas. You want the long version or the short version? She asked. Short. Roxas replied, instantly. Very well. Valian replied. Called out to mission. Found Kuroka. Brought back. Was questioned and placed into my custody. I brought her here. That was short. Roxas replied. You even made like Geno's and shortened it to below 20 words, too. He sighed, and looked down at Kuroka, who looked back at him with interest. Kuroka, was it? Yup. Kuroka replied, sitting up. I take it you're this Roxas that Val's been talking about, NYA. Yes. Roxas replied. I'm gonna allow you to stay here, because you don't look like the type that's gonna try and kill us when our backs are turned, but be warned. His red eyes glared straight into Kuroka's golden ones. If you misbehave in here, or try anything on anyone who lives here, I will look past the fact that you're in Valian's custody and under her command, and I'll kill you like the stray devil that you are. You have one chance. Don't waste it. Quote. I won't, NYA tilde, Kuroka replied, as Roxas walked off to get himself a drink, and then to go and meditate. As she watched the Nephalem leave, the black-haired Nekosho felt her primal Nekosho instinct stirring. My. Kuroka found herself thinking. I can tell from just a glance. That Roxas definitely seems to be powerful tilde. I wouldn't mind having lots of babies with a man of that strength. Kuroka subconsciously licked her lips and let out a soft, NYA, as Roxas left the room. Chapter 5. Anything you recognize isn't mine. It was the day before Roxas and Palutena were to go to the Gremory Manor, to meet the rest of the Gremory clan, and the silver-haired Nephalem was lying, in the mid-morning sun, his swim shorts on, along with a pair of shades, just relaxing on the poolside, as he watched Penemu and Asia, who was wearing a dark teal one-piece bikini. The former was teaching the latter how to swim. Roxas smirked slightly, from his position on the poolside, as his shades-covered eyes gazed upon the scene that was the startup scene for a lot of sub-lesbian porn. Or so he'd been told by Penemu, that is. But at least the pools used in those pornos didn't have magical rituals placed upon them by the daughter of the former fifth strongest being in the world to keep the water that resided in the pool at a perfect swimming temperature, as well as permanently clean. As he sat up, and stretched himself, he heard the door opening, and saw Kuroka coming out of the door, wearing a bikini of her own. To be exact, a dark blue two-piece suit, with white dots on it. Her animal features were out, making her just seem to look even more jaw-droppingly sexy than she usually did. As Roxas thought about Kuroka, the Neko show seemed to have surprised him, which wasn't easy to do with how she behaved while living in his house, albeit under Valian's supervision, rather than his own for the past 3 days. She'd been very good, even if she was a little lazy at times. Oh well. Roxas had thought, and thought now, while he lay back. She's a cat, or a cat yukai, to be exact. Cats sleep about 14 hours per day, so it's only natural that she'd be a little lazy. Single quote. Hey, Roxas, NYA. Kuroka greeted Roxas, walking over to him and bending over, so Roxas looked right up into her face, and got an eyeful of her bouncing tits. Can I help you? Roxas replied, taking off his shades and looking up into Kuroka's golden eyes. What do you want, Kuroka? I just wanted to ask you a couple of things, NYA. Kuroka replied. Valian just got me this swimsuit. Do you think it looks okay on me, NYA? Roxas replied. It looks pretty nice. Mostly because you're hot. Thanks, NYA. Kuroka replied, pretending to blush. Well, there's something else I wanted to ask. What is it? Roxas asked. Kuroka then moved herself onto where Roxas was lying, and shifted her body very close to him. Pressing her extremely sizable chest against his side, she whispered into his ear. Will you make a baby with me, NYA tilde? Quote. Huh. Roxas replied, blinking. What? Did I stutter, NYA? Kuroka asked, blinking. I want to have a child with you, NYA. Roxas blinked again, so Kuroka continued. I want a child from a strong being. A really strong being, NYA. And I could sense it from you, Roxas. I could sense that you're strong. To make sure, I asked Valian how strong you were, and you said that you're strong enough to fight Tiamat, the strongest dragon king, and win, NYA tilde. Well, she wasn't exactly wrong, not to brag or anything. Roxas replied. Anyway, a man like you, with strength like that. Kuroka licked her lips. That sounds like a man that I'd want to have a child with. Maybe even a litter of little kittens, NYA tilde. Kuroka stuck out her tongue, and licked Roxas's cheek flirtatiously. Yeah tilde, she cooed. You definitely taste like someone experienced enough to give me loads of children, NYA. Kuroka. Kuroka stopped in her tracks as both she and Roxas heard Valian coming out of the house, and calling for her. Yes, Valian, NYA. Kuroka replied. What's wrong? The fact that you're trying to get Roxas to give you a child. Valian replied. I may not have a problem with you just trying to seduce him, but Roxas has promised to give Palutena a child first. You know, his wife. The woman who indirectly threatened to pulverize anyone who gets pregnant with Roxas's child first. Ring any bells? A few. Kuroka replied. But though I can't have a child with Roxas yet, it doesn't mean I can't practice tilde. The busty, black-haired Nekosho shifted herself so she was on top of Roxas, and curled herself up on his chest. Roxas, after a second, couldn't stop himself from reaching out and scratching behind Kuroka's ears. Tilde. Kuroka gave a pleasured groan, and smiled. I'm okay with this for now, Roxas, NYA. Hey, Roxas. Penemu, who had just climbed out of the bed, asked. Aren't you going to pet me, too? Right in front of Roxas's eyes, Penemu unfurled her wings, tails and succubus horns, and bent over, showing off her ass, inches from her husband's face. You know you want to tilde, the fallen angel succubus hybrid whispered, and Roxas, who did want to, reached up and gently stroked his Gregory wife's tails, making Penemu also give a pleasured groan, very similar to Kuroka's. Her tails seemed to move on their own, in Roxas's hands, as though they were independent from the rest of her body, and wanted to be stroked more. Roxas, getting a naughty idea, decided to use his thumb to gently rub the love hearts at the end of Penemu's tails, making her moan even more. Tilde Roxas. Penemu moaned. Don't you remember how I get when you stroke there? Oh, I do. Roxas replied. Who's to say I'm feeling horny right now, and would like my sexy fallen angel, / succubus, of a third wife, to help satisfy me? Ooh, you know me so well, Roxas tilde, Penemu replied, as Roxas stood up, a very noticeable tent in his swim shorts, and wrapped his arm around her slim waist, pulling her towards him. Come on, then. Take me to my room tilde. Roxas grinned, and was only too happy to oblige the wishes of the daughter of Azazel. Kuroka, once Roxas and Penemu were out of sight, transformed herself into a small black cat with golden eyes, and followed. Line break. In the Occult Research Club room, Roxas Gremory and her peerage, minus one other member, who was away, were all sat together in the Occult Research Club room, about an hour after school had ended. Roxas was sat at her desk, as she usually did. Mirajan was stood beside her, her rook and her knight. Kaneko Tuju and Kiba Yudo were sat together on a sofa on one side of a coffee table, and Azane was sat on the other sofa. Kaneko was a petite girl with white hair and hazel eyes. The front of her hair had two long bangs going past her shoulders and several loose bangs hanging over her forehead, while the back had a short bob cut. She also wore a black cat-shaped hair clip on both sides of her hair. She wore the Kuo Academy girls' school uniform, but without the shoulder cape. Kiba was a handsome young man with short blonde hair, blue eyes and a mole underneath his left eye. He, unlike everyone else in the room, wore the Kuo Academy boys' school uniform, which consisted of a black blazer with white accents over a white, long-sleeved dress shirt with a black ribbon on the collar, matching black pants, and brown dress shoes. Everyone, Roxas addressed her peerage. I'm sure you're wondering why I asked you all to come here. That question's been on my mind at least, yes. Azane replied. Kiba and Kaneko, who was eating a snack, made similar noises of assent. Well. Roxas replied. I've had a call from my brother's queen, and she's asked, on his behalf, that we return to the Gremory Manor tomorrow. Huh. Your manor. Azane, who had been told that when she didn't attend school, Roxas lived in a large manor house in the Underworld, blinked. Why? Grayfia did not say. Roxas replied. She just said that Sirzechs wanted me, and by extension, my peerage, there, and it was very important that we go. Do you think this might have something to do with Roxas, Roxas? Kiba asked. Over a week ago, Roxas had been told about her second nephew, Roxas Gremory, by Sirzechs, and it was mentioned by both him and Grayfia that they were searching for him. Roxas' peerage had had their own reactions to the revelation that Roxas had a second nephew, older than Milika's Gremory, who everyone in her peerage, with the exception of Azane, had met. Apart from Kaneko, who didn't really give a single one. Kiba was somewhat interested in the idea of Sirzechs and Grayfia having an older son than Milika's, as he was on good terms with the second inline heir to the Gremory clan. Mirajan was also interested, as she, as Roxas' queen, was on friendly terms with the current Lucifer, his wife and his son. As she had not seen Roxas before, she wondered quite a bit about him, and wondered on whether or not he'd be like Milika's. Azane was also interested to see Roxas. Her attraction to power, i.e. Roxas, that came as a result of the boosted gear, hadn't gone away. She'd had many more wet dreams with Roxas at the center of them. The current host of Dedrade heard a scoff coming from the Red Dragon Emperor, the only form of communication she'd heard from him in 2 days. Well, Kiba. Roxas replied. If I had to make an educated guess, I'd say yes. It's probably about Roxas. Else, it'd be about him. Kiba and Kaneko shared a look with each other. What, him, are you talking about, Roxas? Azane asked. We'll tell you later, Azane. Mira replied, before turning to Roxas. Should we leave for the night, Roxas? Yes, please do. Roxas replied. Mira, I'll be back in about half an hour. I just want some alone time. Mira bowed, and magic circled away. Everyone else in Roxas' peerage also did so, with the exception of Azane, who walked out of the door. She was fully capable of jumping through magic circles. The host of Dedrade had learned how to do it from Mira, after asking her for help, but she had parents, who would question her relentlessly about how she managed to turn up in her bedroom without even opening the front door and walking through the house, which she was certain that they would be in at this time. So, the scenic route was the only route. For now, at least. Line break. It was a pleasant surprise for Roxas Gremory, when he woke up, that he didn't have to deal with the incessant rays of the Yahweh-forsaken sun traveling through Penemu's bedroom window, as he pulled himself up, cursing the dry sweat that layered his body. Or, at least, he tried to pull himself up. There was the small matter of 2 women, one on either side of him, sleeping partly beside and partly on top of him, as stark naked as he was, and also as sweaty as he was, in the aftermath of the raging threesome that they'd had last night. Penemu, on Roxas's right, moaned, in her sleep. Don't leave me, Roxas. Nya. Kuroka groaned, as she lay to Roxas's left. Fill me up some more, Roxas, make me a litter. I gotta get up. Roxas replied, reaching and gently rubbing his third wife's hair. I know you'd like to have me stay in bed and fuck you until you're screaming nothing but my name for the next approximately 168 hours, but I can't. Penemu groaned, as she opened her golden eyes, and shifted herself to make herself more comfortable. Oh. Morning, Roxas. Hey, love. Roxas replied, delivering Penemu a kiss. Not surprising, that you woke up first. No, it isn't. Penemu replied. Seems Kuroka wasn't prepared for how rowdy and passionate her mate is in bed, given that you fucked her unconscious. You're almost as bad as me, Tilda. Hey. Roxas replied. Anyway. He yawned. I gotta go to the Gremory Manor today. Yeah, I know. Penemu replied. It sucks, though, Tilda, she pouted. But I understand. She shifted herself so she was on top of Roxas, and straddling him, before she took hold of her huge breasts in her hands, and leaned forward. Let me give you something to wake you up a little. Roxas, knowing what his succubus of a wife was getting at, leaned forward, and latched his mouth onto her nipple, and began to suck. Penemu moaned, as warm liquid poured from the nipple that was being sucked, and went straight into his mouth. Roxas hummed, as after about a quarter of a liter of Penemu's succubus milk had entered his body. Thanks, Pen. No problem, love. Penemu replied. You can drink from me anytime, Tilda, she whispered, as Roxas lifted himself off Penemu's bed, and left the room. He walked across the landing to his and Palutena's room, slowly opened the door to Palutena's room, and walked into a sight of Palutena, dressed in nothing but a pair of white, lacy panties, and reaching behind her to clip her bra into place. Roxas stepped forward, and before Palutena could do it, he clipped her bra into place on her chest, and further announced his presence to his wife by reaching around and gently squeezing her breasts. Morning. He whispered, pressing his lips against her neck, eliciting a soft sigh from Palutena. Hey, Roxas. Palutena replied to her husband. Enjoy your night with Penemu and Kuroka. Yup. Roxas replied. Though Kuroka only lasted for a couple of hours before passing out. She's still asleep. Lazy cat. Palutena remarked, as she walked over to where she had hung up her dress, and slung it on. As Roxas picked up a pair of his boxer shorts, and pulled them on, Akasha walked into the room. Sirzechs has arrived, Roxas, Palutena. She informed them. He's anxious to get off. Akano is serving him tea in the meantime. Just thought I'd let you know. Thanks, Akasha. Roxas replied, nodding. Akasha retreated from the room, and as he got dressed into his normal attire, Palutena spoke up. Hey, Roxas. Can I ask you something? Something hypothetical, that is. Roxas turned around, pulling up his jeans. Go for it, love. If you were to get a set of evil pieces. Palutena said the words that made Roxas momentarily freeze. Then who would you add to your peerage? Palutena's husband was silent for a full 15 seconds, before he opened his mouth to reply. Well, if it weren't for the fact that you can't reincarnate gods with evil pieces, and the fact that I'm only more powerful than you when I go into my forbidden form, you'd be my queen for sure. But you can't. Palutena reminded him. So, who else would be in your peerage? If you had one. Which I know you can't be asked to have. Roxas replied. Well, Val, Akasha and Akano would definitely be in it. As either a pawn or queen, rook and bishop, respectively. But apart from that. I dunno. Why'd you ask? Just curious. Palutena replied, while walking forward to wrap her arms around her husband, who had finished getting dressed, from behind. Can't I be curious about things that aren't more, exotic, sex positions? Roxas let out a chuckle. Of course, you can. He replied. Come on. Let's go downstairs. Quote. After Palutena coated Roxas in a spell to magically wash away the dry sweat under his clothes, the god-class Nephalem and his husband, a fellow goddess, walked downstairs, and saw Sirzechs, who was dressed in rather casual clothing for a Satan, and was being served tea by Akano, who was wearing a black, short-sleeved t-shirt and black and blue striped shorts. Hey, Dad. Roxas greeted Sirzechs, who took a sip from his teacup. Morning, Roxas. Sirzechs greeted his son in return. This is amazing tea. Hee, I know. Roxas replied. Imagine being able to drink it every day. The approximately 6 centuries old Nephalem swore that he saw his father's eyes sparkle at the thought, and sniggered. Anyway. When are we going? As soon as we can. Sirzechs replied. Your family are all anxious to see you, as I informed them before coming here that you would be coming. Right. Roxas replied, as Sirzechs took a gulp from the tea. I'd be lying if I said I was confident that this will go well, Dad. Yes, but you're giving it a go. Sirzechs replied. That's what's important, Roxas. He finished his tea, and handed the cup back to Akino. Now. He created a transportation circle, and gestured for Roxas and Palutena to step into it, which they did. Let's go. Quote. Sirzechs activated the transportation circle, and one flash of light later, Roxas and Palutena were stood outside a gigantic castle, which spiraled to dizzying heights, and featured many turrets and towers. Doesn't that castle look a bit like Hogwarts, Roxas? Palutena whispered to her husband, who looked up at the castle himself. Yeah, it kinda does. Roxas replied. Seems JK. Rowling had some connections to devils. I guess that's why Harry Potter is insufferably popular. Quote. As Sirzechs, with Roxas and Palutena behind him, walked forward, the enormous double doors to the castle opened, and Grayfia stood in the doorway. Good morning, Lord Sirzechs, Lord Roxas, Lady Palutena. She said, in the formal voice that Roxas remembered from 2 centuries ago, the voice that Grayfia used while on the job as a maid for the Gremory clan. Lady Rias and her peerage have just arrived, and are waiting for you, along with Elmilicus, Lord Zeoticus and Lady Venelana, in the living room. Ah. Thank you, Grayfia. Sirzechs replied, as he, Roxas and Palutena walked into the castle. One thing that Roxas couldn't help but immediately notice that there were more butlers and maids walking around the place than he found comfortable. He rubbed his hands on his jeans, as they began to sweat slightly. Roxas, can I ask you something? Sirzechs asked, in a whisper, as the 3 beings, to be exact, 1 devil, 1 Nephalem and 1 goddess who was doing an excellent job in keeping her divine aura under wraps. That woman that was serving me tea. I could sense she's a fallen angel, human hybrid. Care to explain? Later. Roxas replied, out of the corner of his mouth. I hate repeating myself to people. Fair enough. Sirzechs replied, nodding in acceptance. But can I ask something else? Does she live with you? Yes. Roxas replied. Along with 4 other women, not including Palutena. Oh, so you've got a harem. Sirzechs chuckled. That's nice. If not a little unsurprising. I had one myself, before becoming the Lucifer, you know. TMI, Dad. Roxas mumbled, uncomfortably, as they kept walking, until they heard a cry of, Father. Roxas and Palutena looked up to see what looked like a short-haired clone of Sirzechs with red eyes running forward and embracing his father in a hug. Hey, Milikas. Sirzechs gently hugged the young boy. You been waiting for us? Yes. Milikas hopped back, and tried to peer around Sirzechs. Where is he? Right here. Sirzechs stepped aside, letting Milikas clap eyes on Roxas for the first time, and vice versa. Milikas thought for a second for what to say, before clasping his hands in front of him and bowing his head. Hello, big brother Roxas. I'm your younger brother, Roxas Gremory. It's nice to meet you. So, you're my little bro, huh? Roxas smirked down at Milikas, who didn't even reach his navel, in terms of height. Looks like you took after Dad more than Mom. He's cute. Palutena remarked, as Sirzechs led Roxas into the living room. As Palutena and Milikas followed, Roxas clapped eyes on his biological family, for the first time in 2 centuries. Sat on one sofa, alone, was Rias Gremory, his aunt, who he'd met on the night he had taken on the mission to deal with a Poge and the other stray fallen. Behind her, he presumed, was her peerage. As Roxas's eyes idly passed over Rias, he absently acknowledged that Rias, despite him being 15 times her senior, in age, that is, his aunt was an attractive young woman, worthy of being compared to Akino. Though he knew full well that the views of humans on this particular matter were very different to his own, Roxas himself had zero problem with incest. This was because he knew that through the demonic Genesis ritual that the original Lucifer, former king of devils, Grayfia's father and Roxas's grandfather, and Lilith, queen of the sex demons and his grandmother, on Grayfia's side, had used to create the original 72 pillar heads, along with the first 7,405,926 devils of hell, from the dust that made up the ground of the underworld, made every born devil. Roxas highly disliked the term pure-blooded devil, as he'd actually done an experiment that involved extracting some blood from a pure-blood devil, and doing the same to a reincarnated devil, and comparing them. He found that there were no differences whatsoever biologically related. So, hypothetically, any member of the Gremory clan, Roxas included, would be related to any member of the Phoenix or Belial clans. The same went for born angels, and by extension, born fallen angels, as they came from the creation ritual that the biblical god, Palutena's father, had used, and continued to use up until his death during the Great War of the Three Factions, to create angels, some of which fell and became fallen angels. Though something that Roxas always wondered about was, since he had somewhat gone through Palutena's creation ritual, and became part angel, did that make him partly related to all the born angels? Like Michael, Uriel, and Gabriel. Maybe. Roxas thought, as he looked over each of Ria's peerage members in turn. White-haired girl. Definitely a sacred gear wielder. Given that she's right behind Rias, she's almost certainly her queen. Other white-haired girl. Neko show. Probably sealed, considering her lack of a figure. Most likely a rook thanks to that. Blondie boy. Calluses on hands, telltale signs of experience in sword combat. Also a sacred gear wielder. Probably sword-based. Certainly a knight. He then set his eyes on Azane, who was trying to keep her eyes off him. And there's the pretty brunette I met that night. Roxas thought. I can smell it from here. Host of D-Drag all right. Probably a pawn, though I can't be sure. Single quote. After he'd finished looking over Rias and her peerage, Roxas looked over to a second sofa, and saw Roxas Gremory, his grandfather on Sirzechs' side, and Nephalem of Gremory, his grandmother, sitting together and looking at him. Roxas stared back as Sirzechs entered the room and sat on a third sofa, which Milikas, who was looking at Roxas curiously, joined him at, and Grayfia stood behind him. Roxas. Roxas spoke, first, as all eyes turned to either him or Roxas. How nice. To see you've come back. Yes. Venelana smiled, a smile which Roxas didn't return. You look so grown up. Thank you. Roxas replied, taking a seat at the fourth sofa, which Palutena joined him at. There was a tense silence for a full minute, as everyone looked at Roxas and he looked at everyone. So, Roxas. Roxas was the one to break the silence. I've heard a few things about you from Sirzechs, when he and Grayfia found and talked to you. And I must say, I'm rather disappointed. Okay. Roxas replied. Running away simply because you didn't like the way I and my wife raised you, and seeming to have thrown away your pride as a member of House Gremory by becoming a Nephalem. Roxas spat the final word. It's honestly quite sad, to see how far you've fallen, Roxas. Sirzechs and Grayfia both glared at Roxas, but their expressions remained neutral. However. Roxas continued. There is a way around this, a way you can redeem yourself, Roxas. If you so wish to become the heir to Outglorious clan again, you can. What? Rias looked from Roxas to Roxas. Father, why? Venelana looked sharply at Rias, and the crimson-haired heiress stopped speaking at once. Though there is the problem of you being a Nephalem. Roxas kept speaking. However, I'm sure that we can reverse the process of your. Angelic side. Ajuka can probably create a ritual of the sort, that will return you to pure-blooded Devil Dom. I would love to see him try. Palutena remarked. Ajuka's smart, but I don't think he's good enough to negate what my husband went through. Roxas looked up, and noticed Palutena for the first time. Your husband? He asked, as Venelana began to sweat drop slightly. Sirzechs. He turned to Sirzechs, and spoke accusingly. Why didn't you tell me Roxas had a wife? I thought you said you had told me everything that you talked about with my grandson. You wouldn't have believed me if I had told you that Roxas was married, and you'd have believed me even less if I'd told Love of the identity of his wife. Sirzechs replied, calmly. Besides, wouldn't you want to hear it from Roxas himself, father? You know, that is a good point, Roxas. Venelana remarked. Roxas. She turned to her grandson. If you don't mind, would you tell us the identity of your wife? How about I just tell you myself? Palutena asked. My name is Palutena, and Roxas has been my husband for the last 86 years. P. Palutena. Rias spoke up. But. I thought she was just a myth. Humans believe that devils are a myth, Roxas Gremory. Palutena replied. All is not what it seems. Wait, Palutena. Roxas looked, wide-eyed, at Roxas. You have a goddess for a wife. Yeah. Roxas replied. Jealous. You of course not. Roxas replied. I just want you to think about what you're doing, Roxas. Not just to yourself, but. Roxas. Venelana cut through Roxas' words. Wouldn't you like to stay for lunch? We can easily resolve things over some food. I can have the maids and butlers prepare something for us to eat. What? Of course I wouldn't. Roxas replied. I'm pretty tempted to just up and foo. Roxas made to stand up and leave, while raising his hand to create a transportation circle, but Milikas had gotten up and walked over to him. Before Roxas could even get up, he was met with the red eyes of his younger brother, which seemed to plead with him. Big bro. Milikas whispered. Please, don't go. Roxas groaned. He muttered a few words that Grayfia would have pulverized him for, had he said them out loud in front of Milikas. Fine. As Milikas pulled Roxas out of the room, to show him where the dining room was, as Palutena followed, along with Sirzechs and Grayfia, with Rias and her peerage bringing up the rear, Venelana grabbed Roxas' ear and tugged. Ow. Zeodicus rubbed his ear. What was that for? Being so antagonistic with him. Venelana replied. Is the word, tact, not even in your dictionary, Zeodicus? How else are we going to let him know what's best for our family? Zeodicus asked. Like the contract we drew up for Roxas in the event of his return. We need to get him to be able to talk to us in a non-antagonistic way. Venelana replied. Once we've done that, we can convince him to marry Sikvaria, for the clan's sake, and not just his own. Zeodicus growled, under his breath. He then got up and followed his wife to the dining room. Line break. Everyone was sat at a long dining table, and being served food by the maids and butlers. Zeodicus was sat at the head of the table, and Venelana was sat on his immediate right. Sirzechs was on his immediate left, and Roxas was sat next to him, directly across from Rias. Palutena was sat on Roxas's other side, and Milikas was next to his aunt, and talking to his big brother. I bet you must be really strong, big bro. Milikas spoke. How many wings have you got? I've got 6. 10. Roxas replied, quietly. Same as mom. Wow tilde, Milikas spoke, in awe. And what is a Nephalem? Because I don't understand what that means. It means a hybrid between a devil and an angel, Milikas. Palutena replied. Your brother has control over both angelic and demonic powers. Oh. Milikas replied, bowing his head to Palutena. So cute. Palutena thought, before turning her head to look at Roxas. Her silver-haired husband wasn't looking as calm and as laid back as he usually was. Instead, he was looking down at his knees, while eating his meal, and not talking unless talked to. Palutena easily understood what was going on. She knew that the idea of constant formality, thanks in part to the informal way in which Roxas lived his life, made her husband very uncomfortable. She reached out, under the table, and gently squeezed her husband's hand, in a comforting way. So, Roxas. Zeodicus spoke up from his food, and Roxas looked up. I've also heard from Sirzechs that while absent from your clan, you've been training yourself. Is this true? Yeah. Roxas replied, looking up from his own food, which he'd only taken a couple of bites out of. I trained, I met Palutena, married her after a while, and I got turned into a Nephalem sometime along the way. That's it, really. I see. Zeodicus replied. So, Roxas, tell me. I'm curious. He gave a grandfatherly smile that could have passed for Bill Clinton. There was so much bullshit on, and in, it. While training, did you train yourself in your glorious power of destruction, the power gifted to you by Sirzechs, who was in turn gifted it by my glorious wife? Right as Zeodicus said those words, a cold, angry, almost murderous, aura came over the room. And anyone who was good at scanning aura would be able to tell that it was coming from Roxas, who was sitting up and glaring at Zeodicus. No. I didn't. Roxas replied, his normally calm voice one of cold hard steel. I didn't, I never have, and I never will. Eh. Zeodicus looked at Roxas. Really? Yeah, really. Roxas replied. In fact, no offense to you, Dad, but I've actually sealed my ability to use the power of destruction. There was a deathly silence across the table at this revelation. Rias was the first to recover. Why would you do such a thing, Roxas? Rias asked, still sounding shocked. It's the strongest clan power there is. That's actually not true, Rias. Sirzechs replied. The power of the Lucifer and Lucifuge clans, the primordial power of darkness, actually comes out as stronger than the power of destruction. And 3 users of such a power are standing in this very room. Milikas went slightly pink, as he knew that his father was referring partly to him with what he said. He also knew that one of the other ones was Grayfia, as she taught him how to manipulate the power that she had inherited from her father, and he was 100% sure that he knew of the third wielder. Well, Rias. Roxas replied to Rias' question. I decided to seal my use of the pod, because those two, he pointed at Zeodicus and Venelana. Especially Zeodicus, who sucks on the metaphorical dick on the power of destruction like it's Venelana's strap-on or something, kept hyping and hyping and hyping up how I would be the greatest devil of all time, thanks to the fact that I inherited my huge reserves of demonic power from my father, and the power of destruction from my father. After a while, it got annoying. Really annoying. So, when I left to train, I sealed my ability to use the power of destruction, just so I could prove that I can become a strong being without having to use the power that made Dad as famous as he is. Roxas took a breath. So. Do you understand, Rias? Rias was silent, and nodded. Zeodicus, however, was not. How dare you do such a thing, Roxas? He shouted, slamming his hands on the table. To seal such a great power, and refuse to use it, for such a small reason. You're a living, breathing insult to your parents, and to your entire clan. Refusing to use the power of destruction would cap your power immensely, which is something I do not want for a member of my clan. Now killing intent wasn't just seeping from Roxas. It was seeping from Sirzechs, and even from Grayfia, from where she was stood, by the door. Both of Roxas's parents, the most powerful pure-blooded devils in the room, were very angry. Milikas, giving a small squeak of fear, silently teleported out of the room. No one noticed him leave except Palutena. I wouldn't insult my oldest son if I were you, father. Sirzechs growled. Certainly not in front of me or in front of his mother. Or even in front of Milikas, who thinks the world of his older brother, despite having only met him for a moment. And besides, Lord Zeoticus. Grayfia hissed. As my son said earlier, he inherited the primordial power of darkness, my power, from me. And I must say, I can sense it from here, Roxas. Your reserves of that power are nearly as great as my own. Thanks, Mom. Roxas replied. Despite Venelana's best attempts to calm her husband, Zeoticus stood up. I've had enough. He declared, his own demonic power, in the higher bounds of an ultimate-class devil, seeping from him, as he stepped over to Roxas and reached for him. Roxas, step over here, now. We're going to Ajuka's lab, and we'll AAAGHH. Zeoticus' rant was interrupted by Roxas, faster than anyone had seen, standing up, pulling his hairband out of his hair, willing it to turn into a rubber band, and shooting it with pinpoint precision, right into Zeoticus' face, directly in between his eyes. As the band bounced off Zeoticus' forehead, and back into Roxas's hand, the current Gremory head gave a scream of pain, and held his hand up to the spot that had been impacted by the band. Motherfucker. He thought, as Venelana jumped up and ran over to her husband. How can one little band have so much holy power? Wait a second. I'm going. Roxas growled. Zeoticus, let me make one thing very, very clear. I will never become the heir to this clan. Even if you bribed me with all the lordship, prestige, riches and women that you can. Yes, you will. Zeoticus, his hand still at his head, cried, getting up. Roxas. And what is more? Roxas replied, tying his hair back up. I know what route you're going down, Zeoticus. It's the same route you tried to pull me down. And I can't wait to see the look on your face when the next person you try to groom into your perfect heir, / puppet, goes against your wishes, just like I did. I can't fucking wait to say, I told you so, dumbass, when you see your plans for your next heir crumble, right before your eyes. So, as they say in Canada, peace out. Roxas created a transportation circle, and stepped into it. Once Palutena had done the same, there was a flash of silver light, and Roxas and his wife were gone, leaving a very interesting scene behind them. Zeoticus had collapsed back onto the ground from the pain of the flick, and Venelana, who felt very upset that the meeting hadn't gone better, was at her husband's side, trying to heal it with magic. Sirzechs and Grayfia were both calming down themselves, and Ria's peerage, with the exception of Rias and Azane, had gone back to eating. Rias was feeling very confused right about now. She'd just witnessed someone knock her father, someone who she considered to be quite a powerful devil, nowhere near the level of Venelana, Grayfia or Sirzechs, but still a force to be reckoned with, flat on the ground, with just a flick of a rubber band. That aside, she was still confused. On the one hand, she was very shocked that Roxas, a member of the Gremory clan, someone with modern, by devil standards Gremory blood in his veins, didn't use the power of destruction, and didn't have any plans to start anytime soon. However, on the other, he seemed to have very negative feelings about Zeoticus. Though she usually shared a positive relationship with her father, Ria's and Zeoticus' relationship was in a rather rocky phase right now, due to a few things that Zeoticus had dictated about the future of Ria's life, which he stated was, for the good of the clan. But it wasn't for the good of Rias. No, it was not. So, in a way, Rias thought, she and Roxas shared some common ground. Common ground that, she thought, could be used to build a possible relationship with her nephew, whom she acknowledged was more handsome than most male devils, and a few human males that worked in certain professions that she knew. Azane, on the other hand, was staring after where Roxas had gone, and felt rather disappointed. Man. She thought. I really wanted to at least talk to Roxas. Of course, you did. Dedrade grumbled, under his dragonic breath. I'd want some words with him, too. Fucking host-killing bastard. Line break. A silver transportation circle opened, and Palutena and Roxas came out of it. Roxas was seething. I fucking knew it. He growled. I should never have agreed to go to that fucking manor. I should have known it was gonna turn out like shit. Roxas sat down on the sofa, and took a few deep breaths, to try and calm himself down. I know, love. Palutena replied, sitting down beside her husband. I had my doubts, but I was optimistic that it'd turn out well. She kissed Roxas, and wrapped her arm around him. But it wasn't Sirzechs' fault. Or Grayfia's. Roxas took a few more breaths, and seemed to finally calm down. Yeah, that's true. The silver-haired Nephalem replied. And I know. I'm not angry at them. What about Milikas? Palutena asked. That cutie was the one who convinced you to stay, wasn't he? Yeah, he was. Roxas replied. But he didn't know that things were gonna go south the way they did. How about Rias? She's even less to blame. Roxas replied. She didn't do a shitty job in raising me, Zeoticus and Venelana did. On top of that, all she did was ask a couple of questions, and it isn't a crime to do that. It's on my grandparents, no one else. Fair enough. Palutena replied, nodding. Well, what should we do? I didn't have anything to eat at that manor, did you? Barely a few bites. Roxas replied. The food was shit, anyway. Let's just go out to eat. Palutena was just about to ask where Roxas thought it'd be best to eat out at, but she was interrupted by the sound of 2 pairs of feet walking into the living room. Oh, Roxas, Palutena. Asia's voice sounded. You're back already. Roxas looked up, and saw Asia, along with Kuroka, who was just wearing a black dressing gown, and looked like she was limping slightly, as well as looking rather tired. Yeah. I'm sorry we didn't tell you, Asia. Palutena replied. Things went rather awry at Roxas's family's house, and we came back. It's okay. Asia replied, smiling. Do you want me to make some lunch for you? Nah. Roxas replied. Pal and I'll just go out and get a bite to eat, or something. Where? Palutena asked. How about Kyoto? Roxas asked. They've got some pretty good food places. Palutena considered for a moment. Yeah, Kyoto sounds good. The green-haired goddess replied. Shall we go now? Yeah. Roxas replied. Asia, when Akasha gets up, ask her to just take one of the blood packs from the fridge. It's her day today, and I really don't feel like giving her any blood right now. Asia bowed, and nodded. Anyway, pal. Roxas offered his hand to Palutena, which she took. The silver-red Nephalem created a magic circle, and 2 seconds later, Roxas and Palutena had disappeared. That is all for today. See you next time, and like you liked this story, go give /Fan2018 your support.